And welcome to the 2022 Antenna Forum. We're back. (1982) was the first time I hosted this forum, and at that time I was about 22 years old, and I still feel like I'm 16. And we all in this room are enjoying the greatest hobby in the world. And this afternoon you're going to hear from some really, really good guys that are going to teach you and talk to you and help you along, and hopefully you will leave here with some tidbit that will help you with your station. If you have ideas for the Antenna Forum in the future, you can always email me at k3lr@k3lr.com. I invite all of you to the Hope Hotel this evening to hear the Spurious Emissions Band. The Spurious Emissions Band is an all-ham band. They are fantastic. If you have a chance, look them up on YouTube. They have given performances here at Dayton in the past. They will be performing for 1 hour from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock. That's at the Hope Hotel, which is adjacent to the Air Force Base. This afternoon we have 4 great topics, and we have 4 really good speakers: W3YQ, N9NB, W3LPL, and K7AGE. These times are approximate, but they give you a guide in case you need to take a quick break on the timing of when these presentations will occur. So let's start out with number 1 at 2 o'clock. It's important tower and antenna installation and maintenance safety. Please welcome Tim Jellison, W3YQ.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. This is kind of an important topic. We have a problem in ham radio. We want to be loud, and to be loud, you have to go up in the air with the antennas, which means you may have a tower, and you may be climbing on the tower. So we need to make sure we do that in a safe manner. If we've been in this hobby any length of time, we've done things that were really crazy. You know, a young kid climbs up the tower with no safety equipment. You hold on, put on a dipole. You know, I've been in the hobby since I was 13 years old. It's kind of amazing I'm still here when you think about some of the crazy things I've done. With age comes wisdom. I would never do something like that these days. This is a picture on one of Tim's towers. Tim and I have been friends for 50 years. And every time something bad happens to a ham radio operator on a tower, we sit around his kitchen table and lament about what a shame it is. It shouldn't happen, doesn't have to happen. And what are we going to do to prevent it from happening again? So that's why I'm here, and that's why I hope you give me some attention if you do any climbing at all, or you know somebody that climbs. Let me start on this little presentation here. We'll run through it, maybe. Spacebar. Okay, thank you. So I'm a certified climber, but I'm not a certified instructor. So when you guys leave here today, you have no credentials. I'm doing the best I can. There are people who are certified to teach you how to become a proper climber, and I would encourage you to do that if you can. The only goal here is for, if you do any climbing at home, is to be safe. Now I am a certified rescuer, which means I can rescue people from up on a tower if they get incapacitated or injured, and I'm also allowed to climb in a commercial field, which is what I do for money. I'm a certified commercial climber, and I work with other people with similar training. Some of the rules keep changing. There's every 2 years I have to go get renewed for these credentials, and the rules from our federal government safety administration keep changing. So if you see One thing it says 4 feet, one says 6 feet. Just don't worry about it. The concepts are what's important more than the fine details. So if I screw this up, okay, here's the rules. I don't do social media. I barely do emails. My cell phone rang a little bit ago. I didn't answer it. If you don't like what you're hearing out of me, I'm sorry. You can badmouth me if you want to, but I'm not going to see it, okay? There's a risk for guys like me to put this out because it goes on Facebook and it says, you know, W3YQ is an idiot. If you want to call me that, that's fine. Just, I won't see it anyway. And so the other thing is this presentation sucks because I hate PowerPoint. I'm no longer in corporate America. I don't have to do this anymore. And so I just sort of did the best I could to keep this all going. So let's talk about some of the hazards. And the first thing I do when I show up on any tower job is I look to see where the power lines are. If you ever work with a boom truck or a commercial crane operator, he doesn't tell you what he's doing, but you'll see him go like that. Where's the power lines? Because he doesn't want to get up against those. Same goes for you. If you have a 43-foot vertical, make sure it's not going to fall on a power line. That can kill you instantly. Ropes can be conductive on the higher voltage stuff. Just stay away from the power lines and make sure you know where they are. Just do a visual check. If it's your own property, you'll know. If you're helping your buddy, just watch for that. I'm not afraid to fall, okay? I go up a tower, I'm not afraid of falling. What scares the crap out of me is the tower going to fall over with me on it. Now, if it's on a big commercial tower, it was on a big commercial tower, let's just say it was put in correctly. If it's a ham radio tower, you know, I've seen some of the guys, including me, who get a couple bags of saccharine, pour it in a hole, and think that that's a good anchor. It's not. So if you show up at your buddy's house and you're going to do climbing, and I'm addressing you as potentially some people who do climbing, check the guy wires, make sure they're not rusty, make sure they're tensioned reasonably well. Check the foundation, look for rusted components, look for this cheap crap, you know, the cheap turnbuckles. I'm not sure if W3LPL's in the room, but I'll paraphrase him. He said, if you can buy it at Home Depot, it doesn't belong on your tower. And so that's a good rule of thumb. One of the big risks here is when you're stacking new tower, you have to put up some, or unstacking a tower, taking it down, you have to put up some temporary guy wires on that first section or two sections. Guys get in trouble with that. People have, you know, before you get the first set of guy wires, you put some cheap rope on there and the tower falls over and you get hurt. That happens. I know a fellow that happened to. Once you climb up on the tower, now you have to be concerned of a few things. By the way, all these little things that are in italics is including that one about temporary guy wires. Be careful of temporary guy wires. Anything in italics kind of hits home, okay? I know a guy who fell over on a tower with temporary guy wires. This heat and cold thing can both get you in trouble, so know your body, listen to your body. I've been on towers that it was just so hot. I'm drinking water, and you know how it goes. You're drinking water, and you've been drinking water for 6 hours, and nothing's coming out. It's coming out the pores. There are times where you can't drink enough water to replace the perspiration. Today's kind of one of them. When you get up there, you feel that coming on, get yourself down. Cold can happen that way too. If you're up on a tower, here's a good example. You go up a tower and it's not too bad of a day and you have a sweatshirt on, you climb up there. Every time you climb, you perspire. Now you get 150 feet in the air and the wind kicks up, or worse yet, it starts to rain and you get this cold wind blowing on you. Now you're starting to get cold. And if you're 100 and some feet up in the air, it's going to take you a little while to get down. So when you feel that coming on, I'm not just talking your hands are cold and it's uncomfortable, but when you feel your body temperature starting to drop, start down. That happened to me on K3LR's tower. I was up 200 feet and I got cold and I says, I got to come down. Get down before you get in trouble, okay? So you also, when you're up there, you want to work kind of methodically, smoothly. People on the ground can't understand why that moron up there is taking so long to put a nut on the bolt. Well, if it's cold, your hands are cold. Even if it's warm, your making sure you don't drop it. You're making sure you don't drop tools. If you lose tools, you got to replace them or whatever. You could hurt somebody. So you got to work slowly and methodically. Another risk when you're on the tower is birds and insects. I have been attacked by hawks. I've been attacked by an eagle. Insects are a big problem. Usually they're not up too high, but I got attacked by bald-faced hornets one time. So be prepared for that unexpected thing. What are you going to do if you start getting stung? Are you going to panic and go like this and fall off the tower? Or are you going to, excuse me ladies, but are you going to man up and take one for the team, right? So you're tied off, you're doing everything properly, and these little, excuse my language, there almost came out. These little buggers are stinging the crap out of you, and it hurts. It's not going to kill you unless you're allergic. So, just get down at a normal pace and then put some stuff on your wounds. But be prepared for that unexpected stuff. All right, obviously you can fall and get hurt on a tower. That's the obvious part. The other things maybe weren't quite as obvious. But I talked to a couple doctors. 10 feet could kill you, falling 10 feet. I talked to a physician yesterday, a surgeon friend of mine. He said he figures if you fall 60 feet, you're dead. If you aren't dead, you probably wish you were. Okay, so any fall can really be a problem. So the way you prevent falls is you tie yourself off to the tower. You never free climb anymore. Some of you guys have free climbed. Some of us guys have free climbed. Don't do it anymore. I'm to the point now where I absolutely never free climbing. I'm always 100% tied off to the tower. Oh, it shows up again, 100% tie off. You think that might be important? If you properly tie off to the tower and the tower does not fall down, there's no way you can get hurt. Or, well, you can get hurt, but you won't fall and die, okay? So if you just follow the rules. Now, the way you do that is you have to have a full body harness, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment and explain why that's important. And the full body harness, as opposed to that little belt we all used to use with just a little leather band that the phone company guy used to use. We all used to climb with those. That's not good enough. I do know one guy, and say, well, why do I need a full harness? That'll hold me where I want to go. I know one guy, and I'm not sure if he's in this room, but I just heard a story of him. He went upside down. He was holding a piece of tower there, stacking tower, and a rope broke, and he went like this, and he went upside down. Now, if he had just a regular waist belt on, he might have squirted through that thing like coming out of a toothpaste tube, and he'd be on the ground. But his harness, his full harness, saved his life. Another reason for it is if you have to be rescued from something happens to you up there, you have to be wearing a full body harness. I can, but I really don't want to have to try to get you down unless you're in a full harness. If you're in one of those belt things, we both have a problem. If you're in a harness, I'll get you down. And so will any other rescuer. So I'll show you the picture of the one I use. You don't have to use this one. They're all readily available. The one I use is from 3M DBI Sela. I have a good one because I stay on the tower sometimes for 7, 8 to 10 hours at a time without coming down, so I want to be comfortable. None of these things are cheap. Because people's lives are on the line, and you can just imagine anytime somebody gets hurt, that manufacturer's going to court. So this stuff is not cheap. That's a full body harness. That's the one I use. That's a brand I use. Most of my fellow climbers like that brand. But any full body harness. So you see it's got shoulder straps come over your shoulders. It snaps around your chest. You've got leg straps. There's no way you can come out of that thing. Physically impossible. This one is even more expensive because it also has a seat on the back, and those two little rings that are flapping out, you can buy a hook that attaches them. It's like a bosun's chair. So once you get into position up on the tower, you just hook that thing on and you sit down, and you can wave your hands and wave your feet, and it's a little bit of padding, and you can sit there and be comfortable and work as long as you want. To be honest with you, it's so comfortable. I was waiting for a guy to make a cable one time out in Indiana, and I fell asleep on the tower. I was taking a little nap. It was a nice sunny day, and, It's that comfortable. If you're climbing just casually, you probably can get by without the seat or a cheaper harness. It's got to be a full body harness. You may want to not. This thing you're looking at's like $800 just for that. And then you need all the other goodies to go with it. Sorry. What's your life worth, though? You're going to go out here in the flea market and buy a used, cheap harness? I got one in the car if you want to sell it. I'll sell it to you for $500. It's retired. I should probably cut it up. Okay, so there's a thing called fall arrest and fall prevention, and we'll talk about both of them. From a training standpoint, in the United States, there's an organization called OSHA, which dictates how commercial people have to prevent injuries. They talk about fall arrest. They don't care about fall prevention. It's kind of weird. It's like, yeah, you climb the tower. I'm not going to tell you how to prevent a fall. I'm going to tell you how you must arrest a fall once you begin to fall. Hey, it's federal government, right? It doesn't have to make sense. I'll show you some of this stuff and explain to you the intricacies of this. So in the United States, and I know nothing about foreign rules and regulations, but in the United States, we're governed under OSHA rules. And then there's another organization called ANSI, which dictates some of our hardware. Now, the thing is that OSHA has no jurisdiction over you working in your backyard or me working in the backyard. If I'm working for an employer, if I'm an employee, OSHA applies. Now, just because OSHA doesn't mean anything to the private homeowner, that doesn't mean you should just throw all these things out the window. They're there for very good reason. Okay. It covers all kinds of things, but I mean, here again, OSHA is mandating fall arrest for any time you're over 6 feet off the ground. So they're saying that if you fall 6 feet, how many times you go up a ladder and clean out your gutters? If you fall off of there, you could die. I don't do ladders. Ladders scare the daylights out of me. I'll climb a tower. I won't climb a ladder. I won't climb ladders, trees, and I won't go on your roof. But if I can tie off to something, I'm okay. Okay, so we're going to get into this a little bit more, but this is kind of important. So I don't know how you go back in PowerPoint. Fall arrest equipment, when we get into the fall arrest, it has to go on that back D-ring on your harness, and you'll see why. I'm going to show you all about fall arrest, so you try not to ever experience the thrill of fall arrest, because you're not going to walk away from it. For fall arrest, and they call them gorilla hooks. A lot of our guys call them screamers, because if it ever comes to this, you're going to be screaming. So this is after you, for whatever reason, started to fall. And these things, that hook in the center attaches to they call it the dorsal D-ring up by the back of your shoulders there. And then these two big hooks, one of them has to be attached to the structure at all times. So as you're climbing, you move one, you go up, move the other one, and you keep walking them up. These are like a bungee. All that little puckering stuff starts to rip away, and it decelerates your body slower. Not slow, but slower. And for those who have ever attended physics class in high school, you'll understand all about acceleration, deacceleration, and it's nasty, okay? Here's another kind of fall arrest. This one just has this thing down the bottom, says Fall Tech. That's like a breakaway pack. It just, either one of them, if you start to fall on either one of them, that little breakaway pack starts to tear, and it slows you down. These things are not fall arrest. This is called a positioning lanyard. So there is no shock value to this. It's a fixed cord. It's like a piece of wire. And so this is not fall arrest. Don't ever confuse the two. So fall arrest is complicated. And like I say, you're going to leave here, you have no certification, really very modest training, because I just can't do that for you. I'm not qualified. Plus, to become a commercial rescuer, it's 2 days of 10-hour classes. So I'm going to show you a little video about how violent fall arrest is. I'm going to tell you that if you use it wrong, it can be very dangerous. I'm going to show you how dangerous it is. And I'm going to say that I recommend you taking if you're going to do a lot of climbing, take a professional tower climbing rescue course. It's probably going to cost you about $3,000, and it's 2 days, and you're going to be with some commercial climbers, and they're going to teach you how to climb safely. and they're going to teach you how to rescue an injured coworker. I know darn well a lot of you aren't going to do that because it's a big commitment, and I understand that, but I still have to say, if you see fit, do it. Okay, so the forces on your body are pretty surprising when you do a fall arrest. And the tie-off point is important because you're going to see why, because of the forces, so you just can't tie it off anywhere. And it will save your life if you do it right, but you're going to be hurt. Your body is not designed to decelerate like that. All your organs are going to want to keep on going down to your feet. And for men, you've got a couple of things that are going to be a problem on your harness if you don't have the straps tied up tight enough. I know one guy, he was a young guy in one of these classes I went to, and he said, I wanted to see what would happen. So I had an old fall arrest cord, and I just went up like 20 feet, and I jumped off. And he goes, it was the most excruciating thing I have ever experienced in my life. And he was like a 20-year-old kid. And he goes, I couldn't walk for 3 days, and it wasn't because of the thing between his legs. He goes, I hurt from the top of my head to the bottom of my toes, just because of the acceleration forces, even with the shock cords. Okay, so attach only to the back D-ring. We've already talked about that. This 4,000 pounds is now 5,000 pounds. Whatever you attach to should be rated to hold 5,000 pounds. Now, we're not structural engineers, so we don't know. So in one of my classes, the instructor said, a pickup truck weighs 4,000 to 5,000 pounds. Where you hook that fall arrest cable, will it support a pickup truck? That's your, rule of thumb. All right, now how do I double click? Anybody know? Oh, how do I play that video? I practiced it on my little laptop. How do I go back?
Well, let's see.
You don't know either. Now double click. Yep.
Can't. Sorry.
Go. Let's try this. Whoop.
No. That's
Well,
not going to play on this.
Well, geez, you don't get to see the fun part.
I'm sorry.
The middle of the what?
The middle of the box?
Go back up. Double click. Double.
I'm doing.
Okay, we're not good. It's not going to work.
Wait, let me try one more thing.
Oh.
Nope.
All right.
Not on this PC.
Two former cellular technicians, neither of us can figure out how to use this stupid thing. All right. Here's the deal. I tried. Like I say, don't blame me. I hate PowerPoint, remember? Go on YouTube when you get home and you go to the hotel. Do a search for fall arrest equipment. There are videos out there. Here's the gist of this video that we attempted to show. When you start to fall, you let go of something, you let go of that tower, you start to accelerate. And it's been a long time since I was in physics, so I don't remember all the formulas, but you start to accelerate towards terminal velocity. And it happens fairly quickly. These shock arrest cables, and here again, I don't remember the numbers. They start to rip, they start to come apart in 6 feet, and within 9 feet they're supposed to stop you. And so they slow you down. But during that acceleration period, this mass of your 200-pound body starts to exert extreme forces on that rip-away cable. And even by the time it starts to slow you down a little bit, the reason for that 5,000 pounds attachment point is you're going to be exerting a force of like 1,000 pounds or whatever. The videos had all these numbers. And so if you don't do this right, like you hook that fall arrest cable on the side of your harness, it'll break your back. It's got to go on the back D-ring, the dorsal D-ring. And I'm sorry, it didn't work. It was kind of it was like driver's ed. Remember driver's ed? They show you like this guy, he's going down the road and he runs into the back of a dump truck. It's like that. It scares the crap out of you. That was my intention. Now, when you do this, any kind of tower climbing, you should have a rescue plan. How are you going to get the injured guy off the tower? Being that I'm a trained rescuer, but maybe nobody else is with you, you're probably going to call the fire department. I was talking to a fire chief yesterday, and he said, well, he doesn't have anybody who can come up and get you. If you're in a big city, you're in downtown Dayton or you're downtown Columbus, they have people that can get you off a high-rise building. If you're in a little town in Kansas, good luck. Look around. Look, I know some of you folks are part of volunteer firemen or fire departments, and a lot of times the firefighters are young kids, young girls. The chief might be 62 years old, and is somebody going to be able to come up and get you? So kind of plan ahead and just be careful about it. All right, now if I could have showed you the video, this would have made more sense. But this is one of the reasons I'm here. This was on the internet. I don't remember the guy's call sign, but he's one of us. And this picture, which I blanked out his face, if he sees it, if he's here, I know he's going to be mad at me. I'm not making fun of this guy. It's just that he thought he was doing the right thing, but there's just all kinds of things wrong with this tower. It looks like he's up on top of a 300-foot commercial, one of the old commercial towers, and he does not have a full body harness. He has one of those old lap belts, and he has his fall arrest cable attached to the side D-ring. So if he steps off the edge, here's what's going to happen. He's going to start to accelerate. Now, it depends on how he falls. He may spin. We don't know. But in any event, he's going to come down in some kind of a weird manner. And this fall arrest is going to start to slow him down. And his head and his feet are going to try to keep going. And his waist is going to start to slow down to a stop. But the top and the top part and the bottom part of his body will keep on going. And it's probably going to snap his back, just his spine like a pencil. Now he's going to be, and he may come out of that belt. He may go upside down. He may come out of that belt. Best case scenario is he may survive, which means somebody's going to have to get him down. Worst case, I don't know if it's worst case that he falls to his death. He's going to be so gravely injured, the poor fella. And the other thing is that, this is not Hollywood. When somebody gets in a situation like that and he's going to perish, it's not the John Wayne thing where you die instantly. This poor guy is going to be in agony. The rescue people are going to have to live with what they see for the rest of his life, or for the rest of their lives. Don't do this, okay? If you're going to go up there and do this kind of stuff for your repeater club, your radio club, putting the antenna up there, either hire the right people or get the right equipment or something, but just don't do this. He didn't know any better. It's not his fault. And we used to do that. I used to go up on towers like that without anything on. Maybe that was better. I would have just died quicker. All right, so interestingly, OSHA rules address only the fall arrest. They don't talk about how to prevent fall arrest. What we've been talking about up till now with this fall arrest is all federal rules. I'm saying you don't want to do it. Remember this 20-year-old kid that jumped off the tower? He's testament. You don't want to get to that point. You want to prevent that. Yeah, this might get a little bit convoluted. Maybe we shouldn't even put this slide in there. But the fall arrest keeps you from going splat once you fall. The positioning equipment that I'm going to kind of explain to you keeps you from getting to the point where you start to fall. And I would rather try to emphasize that. The other thing with positioning equipment is it frees your hands. If you're holding on to the tower and you got one hand, well, good for you. What are you going to do? If you have the proper equipment, you can let go and swing your feet and do whatever you want. Nothing's going to happen to you. So it's not an either or. Just use both. Use the positioning equipment so you can get into position and do the work. Use the fall arrest in case something goes wrong. It'll save your life. So use them both. All right. So this thing I showed you before, I said had no spring to it. It's a fixed device, and it's a positioning lanyard. That's so you can wrap it around the tower or whatever you're working on and free your hands up. Don't hook this on the back D-ring. It doesn't have to give. It'll snap you. And this is another positioning device. This is, remember I told you had the seat. And I wished I'd have brought my harness with me. Forgive me, I left it at my last job. I didn't think to bring it with me to show you. But this is what hooks on those two rings on the side. You hook it on a tower and then you can sit down. All this stuff's available online. All right, now here's me a long time ago trying to show this to you. So that red strap around the tower is a positioning lanyard. It's the red version of the yellow one I just showed you. It goes around there. And the way since a lot of people have roan towers, here's how I climb roan towers. I climb them like a telephone lineman going up the pole, except I don't have the spurs on. You know, you just hop that lanyard up and up we go. And it's easier on your arms. I'm 63, I have no upper body strength anymore. So I always want to have that on there, and then I take a step up and I can let go because the lanyard's holding me. And then I jump the fall arrest up, and then I do it again, jump the other fall arrest up. So I'm actually positioning with a lanyard, and that's an easier way to climb a roan tower. Now if you get up to an obstruction like a guy wire, you can put the little seat hook on, take the lanyard off, go above the guy wire, take the seat off and continue on your merry way. So I use both of them. The blue thing is the fall arrest, and the red thing is the positioning device or the fall prevention. Now, here's a roan 25 tower. There's my fall arrest attachment point. Do you think that's going to hold a pickup truck? Now this goes into when you go to tower class. Somebody's going to say, excuse me, Mr. Instructor, but sometimes I climb around 25 towers, and there's nothing on there that will hold a pickup truck, including the structure itself. Yeah, you're right. Just do the best you can. Here's how you do the best you can. You go around the leg. That's the strongest part on a roan tower, is go around the leg right by the horizontal braces. Now, is that going to hold a pickup truck? Probably not. But this way, what's going to happen is each of those rungs lets go, it's going to go bump to the next one, so you go bump, 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 all the way down to the ground. It's the best you can do, guys. Like I say, don't get to this point. Use the positioning stuff and think ahead. Just don't get into a fall, but use the fall arrest just in case. I don't know why I have that in there again. Excuse me. Now here's one thing I wanted to show you. When you get to the top of the tower with your lanyard, realize that you could go up and over the top of that top section, right? Once you get above all guy wires and the mast pipe isn't on there yet and all that, just do a simple wrap around the tower leg under that last rung. That way you can't, your little lanyard can't go up and over. See, some of this stuff's common sense, but if you're not paying attention and you do that and you go hop and go up over the end, now you better hope that fall arrest is going to save your butt. And then this is the seat. This is me sitting on the seat. It doesn't really show how that attaches on the front of the harness, but and I don't have fall arrest hooked up here just because I want to make sure you could see the seat hook. You can sit like that literally. I mean, all the weight is off my feet. All the weight is off my legs. My back is in relaxation mode. I can sit in that position on a tower, and you know, you start to kind of get a numb butt, you know, so you can stand on the tower and move around, and you know, no big deal. It's just like, you know, you guys want to get up here real quick, I'm sure. So you can move around, get a little blood circulation going. All right, how about hard hats? Everybody's got one of them. Anybody near a tower's got to have a hard hat. Don't stand under the base. I can't tell you how many times I've worked for a ham radio guy and I'm doing my thing and I look down and he's standing down there right at the base of the tower. And don't do that. Have a hard hat on, but even when you have a hard hat on, don't stand below me. Because if I drop a wrench, it's going to hurt you. All right? I don't know. Why do people not wear hard hats? Do they think they're not cool? I mean, you can get them all different colors at the Home Depot. They're cheap. You can get red ones. You can get some that look like cowboy hats if you want to look really cool. My argument to young guys who don't, I catch them not wearing one, it's like, what, you think you don't look cool wearing a hard hat? Are you going to look cool when you're in a nursing home and somebody's wiping your butt for the rest of your life? Wear a hard hat. It's easy. The other thing is when you're climbing, people go, what, people drop things on your head when you're climbing a tower? It's like, no. But what happens is I come up underneath a piece of steel, and all my hard hats that I've ever worn have big gouges in them from boom. And if you don't have a hard hat, now you got blood coming down your face from the injury, and you're going, oh. So this is more from a commercial standpoint, but some of you guys may put up antennas on commercial towers for the radio club repeater. This is a rope grab. This is not a fall arrest, but it is a fall prevention device on the front hook of your harness, just so you see it. So cable grab goes on the front sternal D-ring. I didn't hear you. You don't. It stays vertical all the time, and it rides the cable unless you go like this, and then the dog grabs the cable. You never reverse it. It has an arrow. And actually did a recall on these things because guys are putting them in upside down. It has a big arrow. How can you put it in upside down? If you get into that situation, just experiment with it a little bit. You'll see how they work. As I get older, I do less tramming of Yagis. I actually do less climbing if I can avoid it. If you're going to hire me to put up your stuff, I don't come cheap. Think about hiring a crane or a man lift. The money may be a wash. If you want me to put up an antenna, big old antenna for you like Tim has, I'm going to be there all day. And my hourly rate ain't cheap. Now, if I'm going to be there and we have a crane, I can probably do it in a third of the time. You may actually save money. Your antenna doesn't get screwed up. I don't get screwed up. We're done. Think about it. You can also rent these self-propelled man lifts. We were talking about crank-up towers just yesterday, and that if you have a crank-up tower, it nestles to 25, 30 feet. You can go to the rental place. They'll deliver a 40-foot man lift. You can go right up, do your antenna work and all that stuff, nice and safe. You still need to really be wearing a full body harness with fall arrest on a man lift. That's the rules. But you might want to think about that. We're in this. Hams are notoriously cheap. Don't buy used safety equipment. Don't buy crappy hardware for your tower. Do it the right way. And if the right way means spend a little bit of money on a boom truck, a man lift, just do it. And if you can't afford it, don't get in the game. Simple as that. Okay, here's another thing in italics. You notice it's in italics. There was a comment made that as we get older, some of us guys are going to have a rope going up the tower with a pulley up there, and then they're going to hook it up to their pickup truck, and they're going to hook it on their harness and go, okay, Bill, I'm ready to go up. And then the truck goes backwards, and this guy's riding up on the rope. Are you crazy? I'm here to scare you, but I'm not here to tell the horror stories of the past. This is in red italics for a reason. We know a guy that did this and he lost his life. I know 2 people that did this and lost their life. Just don't do it. You may see commercial guys riding the line, but that's a certified hydraulic drum on a drum trailer. We do that on big towers. I've done it. I've ridden on cables, but these are proper cables. These are like a crane with a man basket or a hydraulic winch on a commercial trailer. Those things, they're safe. Just don't use this 30-old rope and a pulley that's even older and have somebody pull you up. Please. Now let's run through, in the remaining time here, just some of the non-fall hazards that we run into as hams. I bet you recognize that. That's my old favorite crank-up tower. Got a couple problems with those. One is to change the rope. Well, you might be able to climb that if it's all the way down and it's not going to chop you. I call them a chopper because if they're not all the way down, something lets go, you no longer have fingers or toes. There was a guy years ago out in KB7, somebody, I don't know how they ever got him down, but he was impaled in a crank-up tower. And the poor firefighters had to come and figure out how to rig this thing to get him down. I never heard how it ended or the details, but so yeah, if you're going to climb on this, you try to bring it all the way down. Well, then you can't change the rotor because it's inside this mess. And even if it is down, how do you climb this? I like to climb in, some nice leather boots. No, I climb one of these. I've done it. I mean, I've done stupid stuff too. Now you got to climb in tennis shoes, and you got to put your toes in there, right? And you're holding on. You're trying to get your feet in all this mess, and they're just no good. This is a crank up that's not down. So how do you climb that? Some guys have the cable jam. Hey, can you climb up and change my cable? No. I'm not going to lose my fingers, toes, hands, who knows what. You want to get that down, go get you a man lift, go get a crane, do whatever it takes, but I'm not climbing that. That's a lot of weight. Oh, and then to make matters even more fun, now the crank up has a tote over base. God, if I've got anybody here from like the manufacturers of these things, you're probably going to assassinate me later, but this thing weighs 6,000 pounds, so now you're going to tilt it over? What happens when that cable breaks? You better hope nobody's standing over near it. I'm not saying don't do this, but I'm saying just identify the risks. Life is full of risks. I mean, we took a risk by traveling here today. And here's a good story. My wife doesn't worry about me climbing because she knows I do everything right. She worries about me driving on the highway. So when I got here, I live in West Virginia. When I got here the other day, I immediately texted my wife and says I made it safely because she worries the whole time I'm on the road. That's more dangerous than climbing properly. So if you're going to do this, just understand that things can let go. Here's a lovely little device. Somebody yesterday told me Roan quit selling these tilt over derrick things. There's the little arm that tilts it over. Well, the thing is, you got all that weight from the antennas, the mast pipe, the rotor in the worst possible spot on the top. And then I did see one of these things let go. The cable broke. And it's just a good thing nobody was standing over on that side because the whole works came down, the whole tower collapsed. It was just a pile of junk. It would have killed anybody who was over there. And then you look at a picture like this. Okay, here's a neat thing, right? Here's what I say. You got the rotor, you got the antenna, you got the mast. Oh, he's got more than one antenna. Yeah, let's make it even better. Now you got two guys standing at the base of the tower cranking it. You can't tell. This is a poor picture, but it doesn't look like there's any hard hats even. And then you see a couple of four-wheelers over here. So this is like, hey, Bob, hold my beer. I'm going to crank the tower over, If you start to see something let go, holler. You can just see that. I just told you I live in West Virginia. Yeah, I've seen this. I think that's where this is from. So consider using a boom truck or a crane. Sign companies are a good resource because a lot of times they have a man basket will go on the end of their boom truck. They can lift you up there, and they're cheaper than a crane. You don't need a crane. I mean, you only weigh a couple hundred pounds. Cranes are a couple hundred tons, some of them. So think about sign companies. They're sometimes a good resource. Man lifts are a good way to go, but you should still wear a harness. A crane with a man basket if you're getting up real high like K3LR. We did that last summer. Put two guys in a man basket. The crane company will come out there. They have the crane is certified. The man basket is certified. They do a test lift with a big weighted platform on it, and they hold it there for like 5 minutes and make sure everything's good. Then they bring it down. You sign a form. I think it's a release form actually. And then they'll lift 2-3 guys up. I mean, you can put like 600 to 800 pounds in these man baskets. You can go up with your buddy, and then when you're all done, if you got some free time and the crane is still on as minimum, they have like a minimum to show up, then you can, go for rides and look around. It's just like being at the carnival. You can sell ride tickets and do whatever you want. If you ever see me working, you'll see I do use some rock climbing equipment like those little cheap carabiners and the little nylon straps. They come out of, I bought all this stuff up in Alaska when I used to live up there from REI. You know, all the rock climbing people have this. And here again, I'm not politically correct. I'll probably insult at least one person in this room, but rock climbers are crazy. They will hang on this little paracord and this little carabiner, and they have a little bed that they sleep in, and no, that stuff's not suitable for supporting you. I will use it like to wrap it around the pipe and hook it on my belt or hook it on the tower. But anything that is going to support a human being has to have this ANSI. That's one of these government agencies, the Z359 rating. So you're going to see that. Anything for man lifting purposes is going to be much heavier with a double locking gate, you know, so you can't just have the carabiner come loose. So you can use the rock climbing stuff that you could buy at the local store, but don't use it to hang off of or anything like that. It's not strong enough. Now, another thing is, you know, I put this in there real quick because the other thing is you want to have your tower strong. So we've already talked about checking the foundation, checking the guy wires, but the other thing is the strength of a tower comes from it being perfectly vertical in plumb. There was one tower I saw one time in Virginia. A guy wanted me to climb. It was 150 feet around 25, and it went like this, and then kind of went over at the top, and he had like 5 guy wires on it. And I said, "You got to be kidding! I'm not climbing that thing because you lose all the strength." So we had to straighten it out before we went any further. But if you have a guide tower, just get a couple transits, borrow them off your buddies or whatever, rent them, and put them 90 degrees apart, and then sight up the legs. And if you do that, just start adjusting your turnbuckle so it's all straight and plumb. A self-supporting tower doesn't matter quite as much, but the guy wires, everything should be in compression. You know, like a pencil. You can't push a pencil down and break it, but you can turn it on its side and snap it. It's the same with like round 25, which really isn't that strong. If you don't have transits, you can also take like a plumb line and just drop it down the tower, like down the middle or down the side, and put it in a bucket of water so it doesn't blow around, and you can get pretty straight that way too. You get a lot stronger if you plumb your towers. Most guys don't do it, but it's a good idea. If you're hiring a professional tower crew, I recommend you hire certified climbers with proper insurance. In the United States, there's a thing called workers' compensation. Now, if I come and work for you as an individual, workers' compensation doesn't really apply because I'm not an employee. It covers employees. But if you're hiring a real deal tower company or a real deal tree cutting company or guys digging a sewer line, ask them for their workers' compensation certificate, proof of insurance. That way, if one of their employees gets hurt on your property, you have some protection from being sued. A lot of guys don't have insurance. I have liability insurance, and when I'm working for other people, we were covered under workers' compensation. So instead of hiring the neighbor kid to go up your tower, I mean, think about the consequences. You hired a neighbor kid, he climbs your tower, he falls off and gets hurt. He's 18 years old. The legal system is going to say, okay, you let him do it. It was on your property. That was negligent on your part to allow it. He's now injured for the rest of his life. You're going to have to cough up millions of dollars to take care of him until he's 80 years old. If you have workers' comp with a real deal tower company, that doesn't happen. If you want to get trained, I put a couple links here. Here again, these training classes are kind of all the same. There's a bunch of companies that do it. It's 2 days. It's about $2,000. It's worth it. I'm realistic enough to know that most people aren't going to do it, but you'll appreciate it. If you're not doing it commercially, you don't have to renew every 2 years, but it might not be a bad idea to go do it one time. And with that, I believe that's about it. So everything I've done is to try to prevent you from doing something wrong, getting hurt. I just don't. We've been lucky. I don't know. You know, with COVID especially, I was expecting something really bad to happen because everybody's kind of playing radio. But it's been a nice quiet spell, but Tim and I don't want to have to sit around the kitchen table and talk about any other bad stuff, okay? Now, I don't want to bore you anymore. I would love to hear Ted, but for your benefit, I'm going to be right out there for a while. If you have any questions, you can ask me anything you want. You can even tell me all that bad stuff one-to-one instead of putting it on Facebook. So I'll be right out there. If you have any questions, come out and ask me, and then come back in and hear the rest of Ted's talk, and we're good to go. Okay? Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. No SKs. Or no more SKs. Words to live by. Let's go with our second presentation today. Got this locked up. There we go. All right. I'm going to talk about verticals, improving your vertical antenna for the low bands. Please welcome Dr. Ted Rappaport, N9NB.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you everyone for coming out to Dayton. My voice is a little hoarse because we haven't been to Dayton for 3 years, so I spent all last night talking to old friends at the hospitality suite. If you do get a chance to come over to the spurious emissions at the Hope Hotel, it'll be a lot of fun at 10 o'clock. No cost. It's just good entertainment. I'm Ted Rappaport, N9NB, and when before COVID, I gave a talk in 2019 about a dual band vertical antenna, which QST published the same month, May of 2019, and I thought I wouldn't be asked to come to the antenna forum for years later. But Tim asked me to come and present what I know about vertical antennas for the low bands, because I've been working with them for quite a while. And when the mayor of ham radio asks you to give a talk, you say yes. So this is a TED talk about low band vertical antennas. And I want to be, am I loud enough? Okay, let me modulate better. There we go. That's much better. Okay. Thanks, Tim. That's why he wins. But why do we use vertical antennas? And what you're going to see is that the vertical antennas, you don't have to climb. You can just throw a rock or launch a rock over a tree. So vertical antennas are pretty easy to deploy. And I'm going to show you they're the best antennas to use on the low frequencies, 80 and 160 meters. So I want to cover the basic concepts of a vertical. And the great news about vertical antennas is they can be very electrically short, a small fraction of a wavelength, and do remarkably well, as good as tall towers. But there are two problems with verticals. One is ground loss that you've all heard about. I'm going to talk a little bit about ground loss. And also they're omnidirectional. Well, that could be a great thing when you're transmitting, but not such a great thing when you're receiving, as I'll talk about. So these two issues are why you always want to use a vertical for a transmit antenna on the low bands and use a different antenna for receiver. So we're going to conquer the ground loss by putting down more radials, and we'll try to make that vertical element taller, because even though very short verticals work, I'll show you why you want to make them as tall as you can, approaching a quarter wavelength. And then we're going to receive with an antenna other than the transmitting vertical. And then I'll focus on the inverted L, because how many of you have used or use an inverted L on the low bands? Probably a bunch, yeah, over half. And I worked with inverted Ls for many, many years, and I'm going to share some pretty interesting results that might help you at home. Finally, we'll talk about how to feed a transmitter on the low bands and how not to feed a vertical on the low bands. And finally, we'll talk about some receiving antennas. So, first of all, the reason why it's not good to use a dipole if you want to work DX at the very low frequencies, 80 and 160 meters, is If you put a horizontal dipole 60 feet above the ground, that may seem high, but at 80 meters, it's only a quarter wavelength above ground, and it's only about a tenth of a wavelength above ground on top band at 1.8 megahertz. So electrically, that dipole is very low in wavelength above the ground. And you can see the antenna patterns here on the far left. That's for 80 meters. And then you can see for 160 meters in the middle, the energy is going straight up. The major lobe is going right up to the ionosphere. Now that's a great antenna if you want to work very close in with a couple hundred miles. But if you want DX, you're not putting any energy out on the horizon. So on the far right, you see a vertical antenna. The vertical pattern really goes well on the horizon. 15 degrees, 18 degrees is the maximum energy on the horizon. And this is a simple vertical antenna with a good ground system. And I'll talk about what good ground means in a minute. But this is why you don't want to use horizontal dipoles on 80 and 160 if you want to work DX. So here's what a vertical antenna is. Let's look at some fundamentals of the vertical. You probably have seen this for your general or extra class. A vertical is an unbalanced antenna. Just like coaxial cable, it's unbalanced, which means it's not equal in terms of the path and the structure of the feed. In fact, the vertical antenna, the quarter wave vertical, is just a quarter wavelength of wire or aluminum going straight up, fed by a voltage source over a perfect ground plane. Now, if it's a perfect ground plane, perfect conductor, and it's big enough, say quarter wavelength radius of metal, which is very expensive and hard to build. But if you have an infinite ground plane, there's an image. The image of that vertical antenna appears on the right, and it's exactly equal to a dipole without a ground plane. So the vertical antenna is like a half a dipole with the ground creating the image of the other element. Now this is important because you see the real vertical has a single voltage feed V and a current I. The image has a voltage feed of 2V and a current I. So there's the same current, but half the voltage. And so from Ohm's law, we know that a vertical then will have half the resistance or half the impedance of a dipole. So a vertical, because it's above a ground plane, is more directive. In fact, it's twice the directivity of a dipole on the horizon. So we're getting double the energy in the direction we want for DX. And like I just said, using the image theory, the vertical has half of the impedance of a dipole. So a dipole is 73 ohms. A vertical that's a quarter wavelength is half that, or 37 ohms. Now, in all textbooks and using theory, which I won't do here, the dipole has a real impedance when it's exactly a half wave of 73 plus J42 ohms, and the quarter wave vertical over a perfect ground plane is exactly half that, 36 plus J21 ohms. Now, we don't make our dipoles perfectly half wavelength. We get rid of that reactive component by making it a few percent shorter, because the way we get rid of that J component, the reactive component, and make it J0, so it's a pure resistive load, is we realize that the finite width of the antenna wire causes that reactive component. So to make it antenna resonant, and we do this with all our dipoles, all our driven elements on our Yagis, any antenna we use, we trim the length of that antenna element to make it resonant, to get rid of the J42 or the J21. So a half-wave dipole, if you remember, is really only 468 divided by the frequency in megahertz. That famous formula turns out to be not quite a half-wavelength dipole, but more like a 0.49 wavelength dipole. And by doing that, you keep the same real impedance, but lose the J. So at resonance, we have roughly a half wavelength dipole, but good verticals may be much, much shorter than a quarter wavelength. So the good news is on 160 meters for 1.8 megahertz, we don't need to have a 40 meter or quarter wavelength piece of vertical. We can make it much shorter. And the upshot of using a shorter radiator, shorter vertical element, is it just has a lower resistive resonance, much lower than 36 ohms. So the trick becomes how to match the 50 ohm coax to this much less than 36 ohm short piece of vertical element. Typical short verticals have impedances of 5 to 18 ohms. And if you ever wondered why coax is 50 ohms, it's because it's right in the middle of 73 and 36. That's why the industry went to coaxial cable, 100 years ago to handle verticals and dipoles with roughly the same viswar. So electrically short verticals are going to work. They're just going to have much lower radiation resistance than the 36 or 37 ohms. Now here's a way to think about vertical antennas. I mentioned the two big problems was one is omnidirectional pattern. The beauty is they transmit everywhere low on the horizon, but the bad news is they hear noise from everywhere, and that's why verticals are not good receiving antennas. They hear noise, atmospherics, man-made noise, wall warts from everywhere. And the second problem is the ground is lossy. You need to use radials to reduce the ground loss. And the way to think of your vertical antenna is this circuit. Look at the input of the antenna. There's a resistivity, the ground, our ground, and then there's the actual radiating element, which has this real resistance, 36 ohms or 5 ohms or 10 ohms. And then the various reactivity, which you're going to try to tune out by tuning the antenna, either using an antenna tuner or getting to resonance, with a 0.243 wavelength if you're able to do a full quarter wave vertical. The point is, when we measure the base of a vertical antenna, including our inverted L, we don't know what the ground resistance is or the radiation resistance. All we're seeing is the combination. We're seeing the combination of the resistive ground and the resistivity of the antenna element. But that's the circuit we have. We look at the power input and the impedance input with our MFJ 259 or antenna analyzer, and we're seeing both the effects of the ground and the actual radiant element. And our job is to put as much power in this circuit into our antenna. And we want our ground to be as minimum as possible, because if you ignore the reactive part, pretend that capacitor and inductor isn't there, make it an open circuit. This is really a 2 resistor circuit. And we want most of the power to be in our antenna, least power in our ground, because we're wasting our power when it goes into our ground, right? So ideally, R2 would be equal to 50 ohms, and our ground would be equal to 0 ohms. That's what we'd love to put our 50 ohm coax into at the base of the tower. But we never get that. We measure with our analyzer at the base, and we find out it's maybe like 15 plus J 86 ohms. It's some low resistance. And if that's a quarter wave vertical, and we're lucky, it'll read 37 plus J 0 ohms. That's the best you could ever do. But typically, our ant's going to be small for a small vertical or an inverted L, 10, 15, 20 ohms. And our ground is going to be 5, 10, 20 ohms. We don't know what it will be. We're just going to see the combination of what is happening with these circuits. So how can we reduce our ground, that series resistor that we want to drive to 0? Because if we can do that, we'll get more power into our ant and radiate it, and we get free power into the air. We don't want to heat the soil. So adding ground radials works, and I'm not going to talk about ground radials. There have been lots of great articles written in the National Contest Journal, in ARRL. It's all over the web. More ground radials help, but I'm going to show you the law of diminishing returns that I've measured. Adding ground radials basically reduces our ground. And because we only get to measure the combination of our ground and our antenna, by reducing our ground, it's also going to reduce the Z-in that we measure at the base of the antenna. So if your vertical antenna inverted L is working right, as you measure more ground radials, you should see the input impedance go down because you're reducing our ground. That's a good thing. Now, I've found that adding more than about 30 radials is where you start to get to the law of diminishing returns. I'm so hoarse. We had so much fun at the hospitality suite at the Hope Hotel and Conference Center. I didn't get to bed till 1. I knew I had this talk, so I left at 11, and then I saw an old friend and we talked till 1 o'clock. So I'm totally hoarse from talking. But the bottom line is adding radials are going to reduce the R ground. We want to drive that as low as possible. Now, for the resonant antenna, when we get rid of that X part, when we've tuned it right, the power into the vertical is simply going to be the ratio of the antenna resistance divided by the sum of the ground and antenna resistance. So this little formula is the key to knowing if you're getting better power just by doing things on your inverted L or your vertical or your ground radials. So this is the article I told you about a few years ago, and I gave the talk in 2019 here about this 80 meter and 160 meter dual band antenna with a single feed. And this little wire that went up next to the tower was only 0.21 wavelengths, and it has a resistance of 12 ohms. I determined that by easy neck modeling. You don't have to do easy neck modeling to do any of this. You can simply measure with an antenna analyzer. But to design this dual band antenna, I built a wire that was parallel to this tower. It's only about 0.21 wavelengths, and that's the ideal length to get a 12 ohm plus J0. So this is an electrically shorter than quarter wavelength. It has a 12 ohm radiation resistance. I talk about this antenna. I use an unbalanced to unbalanced 4-to-1 to take that 12 ohms of the vertical up to 48 ohms to feed the 50 ohm coax. So since the vertical is unbalanced, you use an unbalanced to unbalanced, and you do a transformation to make it happy where the Z-in goes from the coax. Anyway, I show this to you because this is maybe not intuitive, but you can have electrically smaller than a quarter wavelength antenna elements that have much lower than 50 ohm resistance, but they're very, very good. They're very efficient. That takes that 12 ohms to 48 ohms. Anyway, I want to show you what I've experienced with ground radials, and maybe this will help you. This is with inverted Ls and with vertical antennas. Using this particular vertical antenna, I put radials down, going from 8 radials on the ground to 16 to 32. In fact, you could do this with raised radials as well. You could start adding raised radials and see where you start to see the diminishing returns. This is on the left. This is with 31 radials. I went out and measured that dual band antenna very carefully. On the left, I measured R Z-in at 1.84 and 1.87. I measure both, and this is a good tip. This is a great tip when you're testing your low band vertical. Take 2 measurements in every band of interest. Take one measurement where your VSWR is lowest, the lowest VSWR. That's the frequency 1.846 on the left. Then make a measurement where your imaginary part is the smallest. And there you see I have X8. That was the smallest imaginary part, the J part of the input impedance. Anyway, I did the same thing at 80 meters as well as 160. And then I added 11 more radials to the tower, and on the right, I went out and measured again. Same location. And what you can see is on 160 meters, look at the top 2 numbers on the left and the right, and the one on the right's way up top. You can tell I wasn't planning to give this for a talk, but this is really interesting data. You can see when you go from left to right, it used to be 43 plus X9, and then it went to 40 plus X14. That looks like a reduction of 3 ohms of the resistance. So you might think, oh, more radials are lowering that R like it should be. But not true, because at 1.872, it went from 30 plus X8 up to 33 plus X10. So I kind of lost and gained 3 ohms. So I thought, well, maybe that's a wash. But you can see on 80 meters, I went from 48 plus X8 over to 48 plus X7. No change by adding 11 radials. But I did drop 3 ohms at the minimum X part, where I went from 50 plus X6 down to 47 plus X7. So I was able to drop 3 ohms by adding 11 more radials on 80 meters. It didn't make that much difference on 160, but on 80 it did, because the ground's more lossy at 80 than it is at 160. So you'd say I lost 3 ohm reduction, but no, remember there's a 4 to 1 un. So it wasn't 3 ohms, it was 3/4 ohms. So I was able to reduce the overall input impedance by about 3/4 of an ohm of the actual 12 ohm antenna. So the 12 ohm radiation resistance was probably dropped going into that circuit with the ground losses down to 11 1/4 ohms. I'm giving you these numbers to give you an idea that it's that sensitive once you start hitting the law of diminishing returns on radials. When I was going from 8 to 16 radials, I'd see 5 to 10 ohm reduction. But once you get to enough radials, you'll start to see the real resistance coming down, but coming down much smaller. Now, going back to our circuit, remember, we want to make our ground as small as possible, and we add radials to do that, and you can measure that. But now we also want to make R2, our antenna wants to be as big as possible. We want to get our antenna as big as possible, and we know the maximum, for a small vertical, if we can get that vertical up to a 1/4 wave, what's our antenna for a 1/4 wave vertical? Our ant is what, 36, 37 ohms, right? So we know our ant, we want to drive that as far up to 37 ohms as possible. So let's look at the inverted L that over half of us has done. And I used an inverted L for years, and I found out how to turn a 100 watt rig into a 500 watt rig just by throwing a rock. And that's what I want to share with you. This is what's so cool about just knowing what we talked about. Because now we can take this inverted L and answer a question that probably many of you have asked. How high should the vertical part be? And where should I put that horizontal part of the inverted L? So this is the inverted L antenna, very popular, 1/4 wavelength long, fed like a vertical at the base, as many radials as we can get. And we want to improve the efficiency of that. Remember, we can only measure what's going in, Z in, for both ground losses and the vertical radiation antenna part of that inverted L. By the way, it's only that small vertical part of the inverted L that does most of your radiation. That horizontal part is really virtually useless. It's almost like a capacitive hat or loading. It's like an umbrella. It doesn't radiate. That inverted L, no matter how short or tall the vertical part, that's your radiating element. So we can only measure Zn, and we know from theory that making a vertical as tall as we can gives us greater R ant. So the first rule of thumb to improve your efficiency is try to get the vertical part of that inverted L as tall as you can. Now, make the inverted L have a taller vertical section. But what about that horizontal section? I was wondering about that, so I did some experiments. I couldn't find much written about it. Is it better to make that horizontal edge taller, higher in a higher tree, or does it matter where it goes? So I did some research and found that a lot of folks have studied this experimentally. Here's one idea of an inverted L, and using a metal CB antenna about 6 meters tall, then attaching traps and trying to get the inverted L as high as possible. Other approaches, Here's using a very, very short vertical element and then going diagonally. Now, given what we just said, what do you think's better? This one with a taller vertical part at the feed, or this one with a smaller vertical part at the feed? Well, we know we want to get the vertical as tall as possible as soon as we can, right? We want a taller vertical section. So this is actually the better antenna. What do I mean by better? It's going to have a higher radiation resistance because we're using a taller vertical element. In fact, this antenna by G4AKE, he measured his efficiency at 20.8%. If you look in the upper left, 20% efficiency means he's putting in 100 watts and only 20.8 watts are being radiated into the air from the vertical antenna. 80 watts are being lost to ground loss. And that's because he's got an impedance there of 19 ohms. And of that 19 ohms plus J159 that he measured, probably only about 3 or 4 ohms are radiation resistance. 15 and 16 ohms are the ground loss, which you can reduce by increasing the number of radials. So here's an experiment I did. I wrote up in the PVRC newsletter in 2016. I had been contesting on 160 meters using an inverted L and using a loop receiver antenna, because inverted L is not a good antenna to receive on a 160 because it's like a vertical and it hears all the atmospheric noise from everywhere. And so I had been running this with a vertical 60-foot leg, and then the inverted L part, the other 75 feet or so, kind of gradually came down to a tree. A tree I could easily toss a rock up to. And so I went out and I measured the input of the inverted L, and I estimated I had 16 ohms of real resistance with that 60-foot wire and the inverted L sloping down gently. And I estimated I had a ground loss of 8 ohms because Greg, WWV, who's given talks here in the past, you can see his slides at the antenna forum in the past, he estimated that typical good ground loss with 30 radials is about 8 ohms in kind of lousy ground but good radials. So I estimated I had 8 ohms of R ground and 16 ohms of radiation resistance because I was measuring 24 ohms at the base of the inverted L. So this meant I was wasting half the power. 100 watts in meant 50 watts was going into the air and 50 watts was going into that ground because I had, I was measuring 16 ohms total. I was measuring 16 ohms total on the ZN, and I estimated R ground of 8. So that meant R resistance was 8 ohms. That meant that it's 8 ohms for a vertical that slopes down. So I was getting 8 ohms radiation resistance, 8 ohms ground resistance because my MFJ 259 was reading 16 ohms plus J something. So I had a 50% efficiency antenna, and I thought, wow, I'm wasting a lot of power into heating the ground. And so I decided to just take that 15-foot sloping end of the inverted L. I took a tennis ball launcher, shot the thing up to 45 feet. Actually, I just threw a rock. I can get to 45 feet with a rock. So I moved that horizontal leg from 15 feet up to 45 feet. It still wasn't as tall as the 60-foot vertical part, but it now wasn't coming down as close to the ground. I went out and did the exact same measurement with the MFJ 259. Now I had 24 ohms of real resistance, just by moving that inverted L leg higher from 15 feet to 45 feet. Now I had ZN of 24. Nothing had changed in the ground, so the ground was still 8 ohms. I had just increased the radiation resistance from 8 ohms to 16 ohms by that little maneuver. What that meant is I was now getting 2/3 of the power into the air. So I just went from 50% efficiency to 66.6% efficiency. Free power just by moving the end of the inverted L. So then I did another experiment, and I did get the tennis ball launcher, shot that thing up to the tallest tree I could find, got the horizontal leg edge up to 75 feet, and then did the same measurement, and now I had a 32 ohm Z in. Nothing changed on the ground. It's just a different position of that horizontal wire, and now I'm at 32 ohms, which means 24 ohms was real resistance of the antenna radiation, and 8 ohms was still the ground. So INA is now 3 times more efficient of the original inverted L I had been using for the 160 meter contest, and all I did was raise the edge of the inverted L. So now I had an efficiency of 75%, 1.8 dB more power for free, just by putting that inverted L edge higher. And 1.8 dB is like going from a 100 watt amplifier to a 500 watt amplifier. Absolutely free, no cost, just moving the wire. Now let me ask you a thought experiment. What if I could throw that horizontal leg all the way up to the sky so it was a perfect vertical? The inverted L becomes a quarter wavelength vertical with a radiation resistance of 36 ohms. And then you have a 36 ohm against an 8 ohm ground, and that gets you up over 80, 82, 85% efficiency. And that's what a quarter wavelength vertical is. So hopefully this helps you to get some free power out of your inverted L by getting that horizontal leg up and as high vertical as you can at the feed. So just to recap, you can use EasyNet, or you can just go to the second step and measure what your input impedance is for ZN, and just try to reduce R ground by putting in more radials, watch the resistance come down, and get our antenna as high as you can by getting the vertical as high as you can. And you can use an un or an antenna transformer to match at the base of the antenna. Now I want to show you a funny video of something you never want to do, and I learned this the hard way. You always want to tune your antenna at low band at the feed point. Don't rely on tuning your low band vertical or any antenna for that matter at the rig or in the shack. Always tune at the antenna. Always tune at the base of the antenna. There's 3 reasons why you always want to match your antenna at its feed point and not back at the shack. One is that lossy feed line becomes part of the antenna and radiates. So you're losing your transmitted energy to something you don't want or need, usually into the ground. Secondly, the radiating feed line, it masks the antenna performance. So you think you have a 1-to-1 match at your antenna tuner in the shack, but you don't really know what you have. You have some lossy series feed line feeding an antenna. And thirdly, by doing that, you're delivering power to a lossy part of the element, the feed line, which is not the antenna. It kills your antenna efficiency. So to get free power, always match your feed points where the coax attaches to the antenna. Make it happy there. Use an antenna tuner. Use an un, use a balun. That's so key. And this is a great vertical antenna on 80 and 160 meters. Something this simple, very efficient. Simple 25-foot piece of wire or a piece of aluminum fed at the base. You can put some coils on it if you want. You don't even need coils. Put a little ATU, antenna tuner unit, at the base. And by putting that remote antenna unit at the base, or building a fixed LC circuit at the base of the antenna and measuring at the base of the antenna for your coax, you're guaranteed to have the most efficient antenna. So I didn't really appreciate this, even though I teach this stuff at college. I thought I would buy a brand new rig, and in 2015, I decided to use my inverted L on 160 meters. This is before I got the end up. So it had like 16 ohms or 25 ohms resistance going into the feed. And I decided to use my new Racer radio and use its antenna tuner to tune the antenna. It had a 2-to-1 Viswar in the shack. I thought, well, the antenna manual says I can tune 2-to-1, so I hope we can hear this. This is what I did without trying to tune at the base. I was just letting the antenna tuner do it. I did a whole 160 meter contest, and I used the antenna tuner to match the 2-to-1, and at the end of the contest, my rig was broke. My antenna tuner wouldn't work. It would like match 1-to-1, and then it would drift back. It was like I had overheated a toroid or I had blown a capacitor by making this antenna tuner do the work of feeding an antenna on low band. Look what happened. This is a demo I did and I gave to Yaesu to prove that their 2-to-1 Viswar tuner doesn't work. Can you hear? Do we have audio? Okay, we don't have audio. That's too bad. Oh, I told Terry. So, okay. The bottom line, let's watch a video and it'll be kind of fun. Okay, great. Oh, just the knob.
Let's try that and see if it works.
Hello, this is N9NB, January 29th, 2016. I have a brand new Yaesu FTDX Limited from Jika Parts. I have 2 dummy loads. I have this 50 ohm load, dummy load by MFGA, and another 50 ohm dummy load right here. You can see it says dummy load in there. I've got 2 dummy loads connected in parallel. There's the T connection and going to the rig. So I have 25 ohms. I have 25 ohms, and now I'm going to use the antenna tuner on 1816 kilohertz, 160 meters. I'm pressing the antenna tuner, and let me put it on SWR. It's taking that 2-to-1 SWR and driving it down to perfect 1-to-1 match. Now I'm going to go key down. You see a perfect 1-to-1 match with the antenna tuner. Power output's a full 200 watts. And now watch what happens over time into this 25 ohm load. Watch the power start going down. The power's gone down to 175, down to 170. The SWR is starting to creep up. It went from 1-to-1 now to 1.5 to 1. It's going up all the way to 2-to-1. So the Viswar cannot hold at 1-to-1 with the antenna. But I learned a lesson to never do that again. Receiving antennas, because I told you that you don't want to use your transmit antenna for receive on the low bands. So there are kind of 4 key parameters I think we all as hams look at for low band receiver antennas: cost, performance, physical footprint, and maintenance. There's a lot of great references. I won't go into a lot of details. You can look at these references for lots of great information. But the bottom line is receiving antennas on the low bands are best measured by this metric called receiving directivity factor, or signal to noise ratio improvement factor. It's a way of making sure your receive antenna has desired directivity in the direction you want, which is maybe a particular azimuth elevation at low angle, versus its overall gain throughout the entire hemisphere. Now, vertical antennas, unfortunately, on this value chart, vertical antennas seem to have a good RDF of 5 dB, but the sad part is they hear from everywhere, so it's not looking at the desired direction. It doesn't consider directional noise. And we have so much atmospherics, human-made noise, wall warts, lightning goes for several hundred kilometers, and an omnidirectional vertical picks up all that noise. So you really want something that's more directional, and there's some great antennas in those references. And here I kind of broke it down with the green being things I thought are good, red being not so good. So the shared apex loop array solutions makes this, it's pretty good because it's small physical footprint. You only need 60 feet by 60 feet in a yard. It's got an 8-directional switch, which lets you look in 8 different directions. It uses a preamp, which I view as a negative because lightning could zap those things. It's an active circuit out at the feed of the antenna, but you don't need any radials, and it is very good RDF, 8 dB RDF. I use this in N9NB. There's beverage on ground, single wire beverages, staggered beverages, great contesters. W3 LPL, for example, uses beverages. I think K3LR uses, no beverages. What do you use, Tim? Short verticals, they're on here too. So he uses arrays of short verticals, which are very good. But electrical steerables, 4 squares, a lot of people use 4 squares. They have 4 preamps. And then, of course, phased verticals or 8 circle array short vertical, which K3LR uses. Look at these great RDF numbers, 13, 14 dB. Now, on 160 meters, it's more important to be able to hear than to transmit. I've shown you how to transmit, but you really have to be able to hear on 160, and you can't do it unless you have these very directive arrays. So they're usually loops. To get the 8 dB or so RDF, you can use small loops. This is the array solution. This is what they look like. They're on a 25-foot mast. There's 4 sailboat loops. And I want to play this video so you can see the value of getting a receiving antenna different than the vertical. This is Echo Mike 90 Whiskey Alpha. It's a special event station in 2016. This is 80 meters. You're going to hear the first few seconds on a loop receiving antenna, and then the second few seconds on a vertical. I think you'll see the first part is easier to copy. Did you hear where I switched from the low noise receiving loop to the vertical? So it really makes a lot of sense. Loops use these little pickup coils, and this is all it is for the array solutions. You have this white box you put out at the base of the 25-foot tower. It could be fiberglass, it could be metal, it could be a telephone pole. And then the controller's up on the right with the 8 different directions. So let me just finish up by saying, you want to build a receiving antenna a little bit different than your transmit antenna. Use a vertical on transmit. You really hear much better with these loops, whether it's a beverage or a loop. You really get huge improvements on listening in the direction you want. It's the way to go. It really beats a vertical or a dipole on receiving. So if you want to get on 80 and 160, I really encourage you to build a different receiving antenna. You get front to back, you get front to side. Returns when the compress and not go down very much when you add more radials. Get your radiation resistance higher with a bigger vertical element. Improve your L, as we talked about, and then enjoy a good receiving antenna to hear all that DX. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Ted. We'll have all these slides on the K3LR at k3lr.com website. So if you missed something here today, don't worry about it. We'll take care of you and make sure that we get, you can get the information right off my website here in about 10 days. So let's go to our next speaker. Please welcome Frank Donovan, W3LPL. He's going to talk about constructing, operating, and maintaining high-performance 6-meter Yagis.
So this presentation is not only about 6 meters. The antenna principles we'll talk about here apply to the HF bands as well. And for anyone who's ever attended any of my presentations, I will guarantee that everybody sitting in one of those chairs out there is going to walk away with it, with some take-homes that you can apply to your own station, whether it's on 6 meters or any other HF band. So let's get started. This is a photograph of my antenna. It's ridiculously large. I enjoy experimenting with antennas. You don't need anything like this. This is an 11-element Yagi, 50 feet high. It's a fantastic antenna, but you don't need anything like this. The best investment you can make with antennas for any band, including 6 meters, is the ARRL antenna handbook, or the ARRL antenna book. And an excellent companion to this is the ARRL handbook, the radio handbook. They both cover antennas and propagation in depth. They get better with every issue. If you own one issue, you only own one issue, and the next one has a lot more. The ARRL has done a great job, including the editors of both of these handbooks, in recruiting very, very experienced hams, many with professional backgrounds, to make these into much better publications than they've ever been in the past. This is the most important takeaway from this presentation. We will be discussing sporadic E-propagation on 6 meters exclusively in this presentation. And the most important takeaway from this presentation is sporadic E, especially on 6 meters, does not resemble anything you think you know about propagation. Just forget it. Just erase everything you think you know about propagation based on HF. It's all different on 6 meters especially. It's fundamentally different. So in this presentation, you can't design effective antennas without understanding the propagation medium that you're trying to propagate through. So we'll discuss that a little bit, especially some of the differences. Then we'll discuss some of the other aspects of effective antennas, especially for 6 meters, but not only. Then we'll look at some alternative antennas very briefly, and then we'll look at some of the aspects of maintaining that performance. As some people have heard me say before, the moment you complete the installation of an antenna, that's when the degradation of that antenna begins and continues. And if you don't have any way to detect that degradation, there's no hope that you'll ever maintain the performance that you originally paid for when you installed it. When I give my presentations, I do not read the slides. The slides have a lot of detail. I don't read them. They're available for you on the websites. If anyone wants one early, they can drop me an email. My email address has been the same on qrz.com for the last 40 years. So this presentation focuses exclusively on Northern Hemisphere 6 meter mid-latitude sporadic E. Boy, that's a lot of words. Well, sporadic E in the Southern Hemisphere is a little bit different. And I'm not going to get into that detail. If you're a ham from Australia or South America or Argentina or South Africa, you know about this. But I think all of you guys are from North America. Secondly, there is one form of sporadic E. It's called sporadic E, but it's not sporadic E at all. But it's always called that. And that's the sporadic E that occurs near the equator. It's there every day from roughly sunrise to sunset. It's not sporadic, it's persistent. We're not going to talk about that in any more detail either. We're talking about mid-latitude. So that, for us, it's basically anywhere in the United States or the southern part of Canada. And the other very common modes of propagation I will not discuss because I've only got a limited period of time and I can't discuss everything. It's transequatorial propagation, and that has been quite remarkable on 6 meters over the last 6 weeks especially. And that's F2 propagation. The new solar cycle has really brought that to life, and it's not part of this presentation, nor is meteor scatter or meteor showers. The antenna recommendations I will discuss later in the presentation are applicable to all of the common modes on 6 meters except for auroral scatter and ionoscatter. And if you're interested in optimum antennas for that, that would be a different presentation. The problem is that the propagation via those two modes is via large scattering volumes, and if you just have a narrow beam width pointed to a small part of that scattering volume, you lose a lot of efficiency. So what's so hard about mid-latitude sporadic E? So this simple little chart shows propagation from Maryland to Europe and Asia. Distance is 4,500 to 10,000 kilometers plus. And what can you work on 6 meter sporadic E? Not just a guy down in Georgia. 2 years ago, the Chinese border. And last year we didn't have that propagation from Maryland, but we had many days of fantastic propagation to the Persian Gulf. That's about 8,000 kilometers. And we had 2 openings to Japan from the East Coast, I made over 100 QSOs into Japan last year via sporadic E, and not just last year, the year before also. So 6 meters is just a fantastic band, and propagation is really amazing. So mid-latitude sporadic E is primarily from just about now. This is really when the sporadic E gets to be reliable enough to use. There were fantastic openings all across the United States via sporadic E yesterday. And that's going to continue very, very frequently right until the early to mid-August. And propagation via sporadic E isn't just a simple hop from Maryland down to Newfoundland. It goes all the way, of course, to nearly China. And anyone who gets on 6 meters for the first time, especially in June and July, will soon discover sporadic E short distance stuff. If you're in Ohio, you'll start hearing stations in Missouri, Georgia, maybe Eastern Canada. That's the simple one-hop propagation. Signals are very strong. Before long, you'll notice longer distance propagation from the eastern coast of the US to California. And most commonly, that's a pretty simple mode of sporadic E involving a ground hop from the middle part of the country, around Kansas, typically. And that hop is somewhat lossy because the polarization arriving at that middle hop is randomly changing from horizontal to vertical and propagation modes in between. And the reflection for vertically polarized propagation, for vertically polarized signals at that middle hop is very inefficient on 6 meters, unlike some of the HF bands. And this is what we're really interested in if you're a DXer. This is the propagation that gets us from the eastern part of the United States to Japan, to Hawaii, all over Europe, and also into the Persian Gulf, Israel, Kazakhstan, almost China. And it's caudal hops. The trick in getting this mode to work is to have a sporadic E patch, and I'll use that term patch several times. That's about the most accurate description of what a sporadic E reflecting zone looks like, as a patch. Not really a cloud, but a patch that's about 1 or 2 kilometers thick and a few hundred kilometers wide and long. That's a patch, and it's often tilted, so it supports these caudal modes very efficiently. So the trick is to get a signal propagating caudally. So if, for example, your interest is in work in Hawaii, pointing west from the East Coast, you need a sporadic E patch about 1,000 kilometers to the west, more or less. And we'll just assume that we'll find other patches between here and almost Hawaii that our signal will intercept. But then at the far western end of the path, we need a patch. We must have a patch near Hawaii, about 1,000 kilometers away or so. And that's really what you look for. From wherever you are, you can't control what patches are at the other end, but from wherever you are, you want to be aware of what propagation is taking place. And we have a wonderful tool now to help us understand what's going on propagation-wise. It's called PSK Reporter. Learn how to use it. It's a wonderful tool, gives you excellent real-time understanding as to what's going on. If I'm interested in working Japan during June, which is the best time of year to do it from Maryland, I look for sporadic E reflections over Michigan. And if there are sporadic E reflections over Michigan, you can be sure that I'm going to be looking for openings to Japan, and there's a very good chance that it will happen. So what's so different about mid-latitude sporadic E? And again, I'm not going to read everything on this chart, but the big difference is that the source of electrons, and that's what does the reflection, and reflection is an accurate term for what's happening with sporadic E patches, as opposed to refraction, because that sporadic E patch is only 1 or 2 kilometers thick, unlike the reflection regions that we're interested in for F2, mostly on the HF bands. So the source of electrons is high temperature ablation. Think of that as vaporization. 1 × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × 10⁻⁷ × That is that day globally, lots of it. And when that gets into the lower parts of the ionosphere, around the height of the sporadic E area, that dust gets superheated, electrons get released, but this is a very different type of ionization than you've ever thought of before. We normally think about solar-induced ionization of atmospheric gases. So what's so different about this? What's being ionized are metals. And that ionization lasts for a very long period of time. Ionized gases in the F2 region last for a few seconds, and then they get replenished over and over and over again. But sporadic E ionization, mid-latitude sporadic E ionization, is ionization of metallic meteoroid dust, and that ionization lasts for hours to up to a day or even longer. And that's what allows this ionization to concentrate into these patches. It's very long lasting. And what causes the concentration of those electrons, that's what really does the reflection, is high altitude winds that are prevalent during June and July especially. And those winds are tidal in nature, just like the ocean. The moon affects those winds in a very significant way, and that's what causes really good days of mid-latitude sporadic E and not so good days. And you can see at the bottom in the center there, the tidal wind variability runs anywhere from 12 hours, there's a strong 12-hour repetition, to 24 to 48 hours, as well as many days, so you can have many days of poor propagation. You can also have several days of really good propagation. And it's also seasonal, especially June, July. And here's some measurements that show the 12-hour variability. These measurements were taken in Norway, and it shows at dawn, on the upper left-hand part of this slide, that the sporadic E propagation begins at about dawn. The intensity shown here from green to red is not intensity of ionization, it's probability that the opening will be present. So get that in your head. This is not strength of ionization, it is probability. So what this is very clearly shows in actual measurements that are shown here is that the probability of sporadic E begins at dawn, but the probabilities are relatively low, as shown in that light color. But as we get towards mid-morning, at about 10 a.m., the probability of sporadic E reaches its highest. So we were talking about that path to Hawaii. So at the Hawaiian end of the path, their best probability is 10 a.m., but there's still a pretty good probability before that. And the other thing that happens is that the sporadic E clouds, sporadic E patches, gradually drop in altitude. And you can see that starting at dawn at about 110 kilometers, and then gradually dropping to about 95 kilometers at roughly noontime or very early afternoon. And what happens there is that these ionized areas meet the D region and they recombine and vanish. But then a whole new set of patches starts organizing, and this is what causes the big difference, the very big difference in sporadic E in the late afternoon and evening compared to morning and very early afternoon. It's the totally new set of patches that develop. So what does this cause? And anyone who operates on 6 meters and sometimes on 10 meters will say the same thing. If propagation is very, very poor in the morning, which it could be, don't assume that if propagation is very poor in the morning that it's going to be very poor in the evening, because the formation of these patches is entirely restored in the late afternoon and evening. So you could have great propagation to Japan, for example, in the evening, and have a terrible morning to Europe. And the converse is also true. The patches that developed that support really good propagation all the way to the Chinese border on 6 meters in the morning, when the patches reform in the evening, there might be nothing. So remember, that's a complete variability morning to evening. This is another measurement of the amount of meteor counts. Now, nobody knows any way to measure the influx of this dust meteoroids. Nobody knows how to measure that. but it's correlated to the small meteors that can be measured. And this shows the actual seasonal variation of meteor influx into the ionosphere. You can clearly see the mid-May to mid-August peak. And similarly, you can see here also the optimum time for the ionization of this metallic dust. Remember, hundreds of tons of this enters the Earth's ionosphere every day. And you can very clearly see the strong morning peak. But this is metallic ionization, not gas ionization. So once this ionization occurs, those ions in many cases last for hours up to a day. But most of the formation occurs in the morning, starting at sunrise. Some easily observable characteristics. Anybody who operates 6 meters sees this stuff. The propagation footprint is small. I see K3LR in the corner there, and there'll be days when I'm working JAs on 6 meters, and there'll be no trace at his station in northwestern Pennsylvania, just a few hundred miles away. No trace. Similarly, and I've experienced this, members of the Frankfurt Radio Club up in the Philadelphia area could be working JAs one after another on 6 meters. I'm 150 miles from there, no trace in Maryland. The footprints of these ionization patches on the ground are very small and cause this frustrating aspect of mid-latitude sporadic E-propagation. The MUFs supporting long-haul propagation on 6 meters occur every day in June and July. Every day. You say, what are you talking about, Frank? I've heard days when there's nothing. Well, that doesn't mean it occurs every day where you are. So there may be days when you get nothing, and our friends in Philadelphia have a great opening. But this propagation occurs every day in June and July, some days in May and some days in August. Preferred antenna, the most important takeaway from this, anything that's horizontally polarized can be as simple as a dipole or a very lightweight 3-element Yagi. And any height, I don't recommend using a height below about 25 feet, but 25 feet works well. 50 feet is an absolutely magical height. And anything between 50 and 70 feet works really well. Heights above that are not so good, and I'll show you why. And a good compromise height is 25 feet. That does have a problem, and I'll show you why in a bit. And that is, it gets degraded if it's located in an area that's surrounded by dense housing. So a low antenna like this at 25 feet can work quite well in a not very densely populated community. By not very densely, I mean maybe 1 house per acre or so. And also, I wouldn't expect it to work at this height in an area where there are very dense forests. Very dense, not occasional trees, but very dense forests. And in terms of extreme variability, sporadic mid-latitude propagation occurs every day in June and July. I've mentioned many days in late May and early August. We've already saw a very, very good day yesterday. Some days in December, and really it's mid-latitude sporadic is extremely uncommon from late January to early March. That's not very much of the year. The daily maximum is from 7 a.m. to noon. You remember that chart I showed you, actual measurements. And that's at the location of the sporadic E patch. So you've got to kind of get this in your head. When you're thinking about long-haul sporadic E propagation, you're especially interested in the location of the sporadic E patch at both ends of the path. So for long-haul 6-meter propagation, Maryland to almost China, you're thinking about the sporadic E patch that's 600 or 1,000 kilometers northeast of Maryland, and then you're really interested in that very early sunrise, the very late afternoon, early evening sunset patch that's occurring near the Chinese border. So we're interested in both of those. The variability is frustrating. Sometimes you can work stations in the Persian Gulf, and 2 minutes later they're gone. That's why we call it the magic band. And the location of these patches varies constantly. For the most part, they seem to drift northward actually towards the magnetic North Pole. That's more or less northward from the East Coast. And they drift northward at speeds of 10 to 100 miles an hour. They can drift southward, but that's less common. Okay. So this chart came from some really excellent work by K9LA, and this shows why we need antennas primarily with low-angle radiation. Mid-latitude sporadic E very, very rarely has a sporadic E MUF exceeding 60 megahertz. So we need to have angles of radiation that are low enough in order not to pass right through the sporadic E cloud. And we can turn this into very concrete data by looking at those 4 lines of information. Antenna elevations below 5 degrees are especially useful for long-distance sporadic E communication, distances longer than 1,400 kilometers. So we want antennas, if we can, that have significant radiation at angles below 5 degrees. And the sporadic E propagation that supports those angles is frequent. This is not uncommon. It's frequent. At antenna elevations, angles, that is, angles above the horizon, 5 to 8 degrees, that is the most common form of sporadic E at mid-latitudes. It generally covers somewhat shorter distances, but we can have multiple hops or chordal propagation. That requires an antenna height of 50 feet. I failed to mention that below 5 degrees, the optimum height is 70 feet. 5 to 8 degrees, the optimum height is 50 feet, but it still has very significant radiation, and I'll show you how much at the lower angles. But when we get to elevation angles above 8 degrees, there is occasional sporadic E propagation at those angles, but it is not frequent. And at elevation angles above 12 degrees, it is rare. So we don't optimize our antennas for occasional situations that rarely occur. And we'll miss all the occasions that frequently occur. So we're going to focus on frequent and not worry very much about rare. So horizontal polarization is the only thing you ever want to consider for 6 meter of sporadic E propagation. It almost always provides a free 6 dB of ground reflection gain, especially if there are not a lot of obstacles in the area. And I'm not going to read all the stuff. You can read these slides later. And in this presentation, when I talk about antennas, in every case, the gain figures are compared to a half-wave dipole in free space. And I think probably most of you know that a half-wave dipole in free space has 2.15 dB gain over the theoretical isotropic radiator. Some antenna manufacturers like to compare their gain figures against isotropic, and you can see why. They can jack up their antenna gain figures by 2 dB. I'm not going to do that. So let's look at a very, very excellent antenna for mid-latitude sporadic E. This simple 5-element Yagi on a 12-foot boom, 50 feet high, will allow you to work 100 countries on 6 meters with significant effort, but it's very achievable in the eastern part of the United States. Very achievable. Many DXers have gone from no countries worked to 100 countries worked with mid-latitude sporadic E in 2 or 3 years. And it's not unrealistic to think, well, I'm going to go home and see if I can put up a horizontal dipole at 30 or 40 feet, or a little 3-element Yagi that weighs 6 or 7 pounds on a 25-foot mast. And if you're in the eastern part of the United States, when you come back next year, you're going to tell me that you work 60 DXCC countries. And you don't need to run 1,500 watts to do that. This propagation is very strong. So what this antenna looks like, this plot that's shown here comes from EasyNet. EasyNet is now a free program. Anybody can get it for free. Takes a little bit of effort to learn how to use it. This is a output from EasyNet, and it shows for the low-angle lobe there. Remember the angles of elevation we talked about? This 50-foot high antenna has its optimum radiation angle at 5 degrees. And it's only 3 dB down. Of course, that whole range of elevation angles that I talked about being very important. That's why this 50-foot high antenna works so well. And it's not bad at the very low angles. You know, we look down here at 3 degrees elevation angle. It's not quite as good as the 70-foot high antenna for really long haul stuff, but it's only a few dB down and it works really well. So I would encourage people who are interested in DXing on 6 meters or VHF contests or chasing grids or whatever. 50 feet is a really good height to strive for if you can do it. If you can't, 25 feet works well also, and I'll show you how well. So this is the same antenna, and I've raised it up to 70 feet. And you can see now that its low angle lobe has dropped a few degrees. So its radiation goes down to a 2-degree elevation angle, 3 dB down, and it has all these higher angle lobes that are absolutely useless. But the big problem with the 70-foot high antenna is that deep null between the first 2 lobes that you can see there. There's a deep null between 6 degrees and about 10 degrees, and there's a lot of useful propagation at those angles, and this antenna won't work for those angles. So this is a DXer's antenna, not a VHF contester's antenna or a grid chaser's antenna in the US. There's an advantage to a 70-foot high antenna compared to a 50-foot high antenna, and that is if you are in a densely populated suburban area with a lot of housing, an antenna at 70 feet gets above all that clutter. So there's a benefit in that circumstance. But if you're in an area that's lightly populated without a lot of dense forest, I would prefer an antenna at 50 feet rather than 70 feet where you're not worried about that clutter. So now we're going to go down to 25 feet, which you can temporarily install a 3-element Yagi at 25 feet in a remote location probably in less than an hour. Probably a lot less than an hour. So this is a very practical antenna, and it will work. You can work plenty of DX with it, but don't try to do this in the middle of a dense urban neighborhood. It won't work well. The ground reflection gain will be terrible. But if you can get this in a state park, especially on the sloping side of a mountain, it will work fantastic. And it's not an expensive or complex antenna. You can see why it works so well. It's got a big fat radiation lobe at very useful angles. So let's look at a really high antenna on 6 meters. This is a terrible antenna for sporadic E, and you can see why, because it's got all these deep nulls at the angles we want most. So if your only 6-meter antenna is much higher than 70 feet, you're going to suffer a lot of the time. For the rest of the presentation, when I talk about antenna performance, for some antennas we're going to look at very briefly, I'm going to be speaking about front to rear ratio, not front to back ratio. And the difference is that front to rear is the ratio of the signal off the front of the antenna, its main lobe, compared to all radiation. About all I can say is forget about it. You're not going to get useful ground gain. You're giving up 6 dB. That's the equivalent of going from 100 watts to 400 watts. Or if you have 400 watts, to going all the way down to 100 watts or less. But if you're in an area without severe terrain irregularities, like the irregular terrain that frequently happens in mountains, especially in the West Coast, or if you're not in an area with very dense urban housing, or if you're not in an area with very dense forests, and if the obstructions obstruct less than 5% of the reflection zone, you're going to get that 6 dB of free gain, 400 watts versus 100 watts. So this is how we usually look at antenna patterns. It's a very simplistic view as to how to compute antenna patterns, but it works very well. It uses the assumption that the ground is perfectly reflecting, there are no obstructions, and the concept that's used is the radiation directly from the antenna as well as radiation caused by the reflection that looks like it comes from an imaginary antenna at the same depth as the antenna is high above the ground. Don't ever try to bury your antenna. It won't work. But this is the concept that works well for antenna models, and this is how we usually do antenna models. It assumes that there is perfect reflection from a single point with no obstructions and no irregular terrain. Perfectly good for models, but that's not the world we live in. So what does the reflection zone really look like? If it's not a single point like we've thought about for our whole ham careers, what is it really? How far is the front of the reflection zone in front of my antenna? How far away is the in front of the antenna is that reflection zone. How long is the reflection zone? I've already said it's not a point. Well, how long is it? And I've said it's not a point. Well, how wide is that reflection zone? And how much do obstructions in that reflection zone really affect the performance of my antennas? And how much does highly irregular terrain affect the performance of my antennas? And the answer is, published in a National Bureau of Standards publication from about 1960. It's well worth reading it. You can see it in the URL here, and everybody will have access to these slides. And it explains the size of that reflection zone. It's referred to as the Fresnel zone. It's a funny pronunciation of that name, but it's Fresnel. It's a French name. And it comes from optics. And it's the reflection zone to be all of the reflections in front of the antenna that are within plus or minus 90 degrees of the phase of the direct ray. Anything that's more than 90 degrees phase shift reduces the strength of the reflection rather than increases it. And there's only one place in that zone that produces exactly 6 dB of gain, and that's that single point that we use for antenna models. But everything else contributes to it. And the 0 dB ground gain is at the edge of that zone. Okay, so how big is that zone? So this shows schematically what's going on here. The main 6 dB reflection is from that single point near the middle of that reflecting ellipse. If you want to see the shape of that ellipse, just take a flashlight someday and shine it down on a flat surface, and you'll see that it's kind of an elliptical thing that you see. And that's the Fresnel zone for that light. And the area of reflection that we most care about isn't the reflection all the way to the edge of the Fresnel zone where the gain is only at 0 or 1 dB or 2 dB. We care mainly about the reflections that are 45 degree phase shifted or less. Okay, so what does that mean? What that means is we're interested in roughly the middle half of the Fresnel zone. And that's the area where the 3 dB or more ground reflection gain occurs. And as I mentioned earlier, we'd like that area, the middle half of the Fresnel zone, to be free of very many tall buildings, dense forests, irregular terrain. So, okay, so I still haven't told you how big that zone is. But here it is. So now we're looking at really kind of the optimum 6-meter antenna for mid-latitude sporadic E. And the size of the reflection zone and the location of that reflection zone, keep in mind that's about half the size of the Fresnel zone, starts about 150 feet in front of the antenna. So that's where we start worrying about obstructions. And it extends for 2,000 feet. So, you know, we might think we're in a pretty clear spot, but there might be a suburban neighborhood out there 800 or 1,000 feet out, and it starts to affect the gain. And it's 200 feet wide. So that's pretty substantial. But we're mainly interested in severe obstructions, large buildings, many buildings, or very dense forests. So what about other heights? So we raised this antenna to 70 feet, so it's a little bit of a better DXing antenna. And now the far end of the reflection zone extends out to 2,500 feet rather than 2,000 feet. The near edge of the reflection zone is now at 200 feet rather than 150. By the way, if you want to do your own computations, this reference I showed you tells you how to do that. Doesn't talk about computers or anything because this was written about 1960, but everything you need to know about computing your Fresnel zone is all there. And if you can't figure it out, send me an email and I'll help you. So this is 70 feet, so the Fresnel zone is bigger, extends further away. What about that 25-foot high antenna I talked about? That's pretty good. Notice the near edge of the Fresnel zone is only 25 feet in front of the antenna. So now I really care about stuff that's really close in that might be obstructing. And the far end of the reflection zone is only half as far as it is for the 50-foot high antenna. So I worry about severe obstructions much less, because the reflection isn't as far away as it is for a 50-foot antenna. Now here's a trick that you can play, and it really works. And that is if you're on sloping ground, the entire radiation pattern tilts downward. So here we take or a simple 25-foot high antenna, weighs 5 or 6 pounds, on a simple 25-foot mast, and we're on a VHF grid expedition. Well, if we can find a hill with sloping terrain in front, the entire pattern slopes down by, in this example, the slope over a distance from 100 feet to 1,000 feet in front of the antenna. The slope is downward 100 feet over a distance of 1,000 feet. So if in front of the antenna, extending out a quarter of a mile, more or less, if the terrain drops 100 feet, then this simple 25-foot high antenna is effectively 50 feet high. So if you want to temporarily install an antenna, don't put it in the middle of New York City. Find a hillside with some slope, put the antenna at that slope, and you'll get the benefit of that slope. And it's all about the Fresnel zone. And you care about a relatively small distance because the antenna is only 25 feet high. Okay, so we're going to look at some antennas very quickly. You can study these charts later. So we're going to look mainly at some simple small antennas that are relatively inexpensive. They're lightweight, easy to install, don't require heavy masts or anything of that kind. This data comes from VE7BQH, a ham who puts a lot of effort into evaluating the performance of antennas, where the manufacturers will share the detailed dimensions of the antennas. So Lionel shares this data freely. He updates his charts a couple times a year, so we have an unbiased judge that we can use to compare the performance of antennas we can actually buy. I included a very simple but very effective antenna in this list. That's the M-square 3-element Yagi, the 6M3. It's a real good Yagi, doesn't have incredibly good front to back, but I'll tell you, you install this thing on a 25-foot mast in 1 year, you're going to tell me about how you worked 50 countries on 6 meters 1 year from now. Most of that's going to happen in June and July. And of course, there are better antennas that are still not very heavy, and I've shown them here. You can look at those later. Some of those have really good front-to-back ratio. One of those is the YU7EF 5-element Yagi. And I'll just show a couple of photographs of some of those Yagis. This M-square antenna is only 6 pounds. This E antenna, loop-fed Yagi, and loop-fed Yagis are getting to be very popular because especially their front-to-back ratio is very good. Notice this has 21 dB front-to-back according to VE7BQH's measurements, and this antenna is on only a 10-foot boom. This is a little bit bigger antenna, also by E Antennas. It weighs 17 pounds. Also loop-fed, you can see here. And this is not a loop-fed Yagi, so that's not the only way to get good front-to-back ratio. YU7EF developed this antenna. You can't buy it, but it's very easy to build 6-meter antennas. This antenna, according to the unbiased work that VE7BQH did, produces 24 dB of front-to-back with only a 14-foot boom. And this is a bigger antenna, 19 dB front-to-back, loop-fed. So what about bigger antennas? These are some pretty impressive figures for lightweight, relatively inexpensive antennas. The main reason we go to longer boom Yagis is not the gain. The main reason is the incredible front-to-backs we can get. And look at all the front-to-backs here. These are the highlighted front-to-backs compare to the lower front-to-backs of the smaller Yagis. And one Yagi here really stands head and shoulders above the others, but it's also very large, and that's the one at the bottom, the Inov 8-element LFA. And I'll show you a photograph of a really fantastic antenna system built that way. So these are some photographs of those antennas, and I'm just going to click through them quickly. You can look at them yourself later. So these are 5- and 6-element Yagis. This is an antenna system that never should have been built. Why? It's a 180-foot tower, and chances are most of the Yagis above 100 feet contribute little or nothing to the performance of the array. Now, once F2 gets going, perhaps this fall, this big array might offer some benefit. But for mid-latitude sporadic E, which is the primary source of us being able to work DXCC on 6 meters without a lot of trouble from the East Coast, if you simply built this antenna with a single Yagi at 50 feet, you'll get like 90% of the benefit of this 180-foot high antenna system at probably a few percent of the cost. This is another big E-antenna, 7-element Yagi, loop fed, you notice. This is a conventional Yagi, developed long before the appearance of the loop Yagis. It performs quite well. Doesn't have the incredible 25 to 30 dB front to back. It's a very popular antenna and it works really well. And this is a conventional Yagi whose design goes back about 15 or 20 years. This is the pair of 8 LFAs, that really fantastic antennas. JA1BK is a fixture on 6 meters. When 6 meters opens from the United States to Japan, there's a pretty good chance you're going to hear JA1BK, and he's likely to be the most consistent and strongest signal on the band. Well, look at his antennas. It's a pair of those fantastic 8-element Yagis. I don't know the exact height, but I suspect it might be 50 and 70 feet, 50 feet and 70 feet. So 6-meter antennas are really easy to build, and I encourage people to build them. That antenna I showed you that I built. I love building antennas. And the materials are readily available, and shown on these slides, and I'm not going to read them, are some of the materials you can buy from DX Engineering to build your own antennas. And of course, if you have an aluminum supplier in your area, you can buy from them as the same materials. It's very important in Yagi antennas to protect all of the mating surfaces from corrosion. And this is the most reliable anti-seize I have ever used. K3LR also uses it on his antennas. It's called JetLube SS30. And you can buy it from DX Engineering, among other sources. What's special about this? I've been using it for 40 years. I've taken apart many Yagis that I've built with it, and I have never found this material to be dried out. The elements come apart easily, even though they may have been joined together for 30 years. I have not had that experience before using SS30 with some of the alternative products. They tend to dry out. And then the elements are stuck. The whole idea of using this was to be able to get them apart early, and if the material dries out, then it's hard to get it apart. And here's materials you can use to build booms of various Yagis for 6 meters. I won't read it. The data's all here for you to look at later. I like to build my antennas now with these plastic clamps. Stolf is one of the popular manufacturers, but there are many places to buy it. I've shown one particular website as to where you can buy it. You can see that what the construction looks like. A lot of antennas we've built in the past, we've used U-bolts, but this material works really well. The only thing I would do differently compared to this photograph, the nuts that you can see in this photograph are nylon insert locking nuts, trade name Nylock. And in this photograph, that plastic material is pointing upwards into the sun. It's a bad idea. UV can degrade that. So if you're using Nylock hardware anywhere in your antenna system, it's a good idea to point the nuts down so they're in the shadow rather than pointing them up like they are. And you can see those nuts are in the sun. And that nylon is likely to degrade over a very long period of time. So I just don't do that. Okay, another very important aspect. So you spend all this money and all this effort getting your antennas up at an optimum height, building or purchasing the best antenna you can afford. But if you don't put an RFI suppression choke at the feed point, you lose a lot of the performance of the antenna. And the reason is, and I'll just ask this, anybody who knows the answer, how many terminals are there at the end of a piece of RG213? Does anybody know? The possible answers are 2 and 3. And what's the answer? What's the answer? How many terminals? 3. That's correct. The end of coaxial cable has 3 terminals, not 2. What is he talking about? I can look at that and I can see the outside of the shield has different signals flowing on it than the inside of the shield. So you got the center conductor, we all agree that's 1. We all agree that the inside of the shield is the second one, but you forgot to count the outside of the shield, that's the third one. So it's a 3-terminal device, and the purpose of the choke is to eliminate any signals coming in by that third terminal on the coax. And what you use is a choke to prevent that. You can buy them, you can build them. This is an example of a common choke. It's very easy to build, but there's a problem. and that is that the characteristics, the capacitance of the outside of the coax, this is a resonant choke, is not controlled by the manufacturer. So if I build one and I say, okay, John, my friend John, go off and build one, John could have a big problem, because performance of his choke might be different than the one that I built out of similar material. So with these RFI suppression chokes wound out of coax, you need to have some mechanism to measure the resonant frequency of the choke. You want it to be in or very close to the 6 meter band. So this is good, it's cheap, it's bad, you have to do some measurements. This is a very popular way to solve the same problem. It's much more broadband, so it's not, it's still resonant, but the resonance is much broader. And you can make your own with ferrite cores you can buy from DX Engineering and other sources, or you can build already assembled chokes. And I've shown 2 sources of already constructed chokes here. A very important takeaway from this slide. On any of your antennas where you've already put RFI suppression chokes on the antenna at the feed point, if you have fastened those chokes, whether it's coiled coax or ferrite, if you've attached those chokes directly to the boom of your Yagi, those chokes probably don't work very well, because there's a lot of capacitance between the boom of the Yagi and the choke that you've attached directly to it. You've provided a path for all that RFI you don't want to get around the choke. So you can see here that this choke is mounted several inches above the boom, and we look at the previous slide for that simple coil coax choke, notice it's several inches away from the boom. That's the only way to attach chokes to a Yagi. And here's a very high performance choke designed by K9YC, and if you are in a very noisy RFI environment, you might consider this one, and the website is shown here. Okay, so now we've done all this work of buying a really good Yagi, putting it at a height that works really well, trying to avoid a lot of obstructions in front of the antenna, and now we have to deal with coax cable loss. Coaxial cable is very lossy on 6 meters, and this is feet per dB. You know, we're used to the chart that shows dB per 100 feet, but that's not what this is. It's the same data. So RG8X, if I put my antenna up 50 feet, I've already got more than 1 dB of loss before I get to the ground. And even with RG213, it's 60 feet per dB. So if I put my antenna at 50 feet, unless I put my radio right at the mast base, I'm probably going to have 100 feet of RG213, and I've got quite a bit of loss. Well, the good news is that 50 ohm hardline, which is readily available, if you go out into the Hamfest here, you'll find thousands and thousands of feet of half-inch 50 ohm hardline. And its loss is 200 feet per dB. So it's really an excellent choice. So you might say, okay, Frank, well, if half-inch hardline is so good, what about 7/8 hardline? That's really good, right? It is. But if you look down at the very bottom of the chart, you need to have coaxial cable that's 475 feet long before 7/8 hardline gives you 1 dB of advantage. Nothing wrong with 7/8 inch hardline, but you don't get much back for your investment until the feed line is really long. Reliable coax connectors, both N and UHF connectors, are very effective on 6 meters. The one I use in a moment. N connectors are fine, but most hams are clueless about how to install them correctly. They are precision devices, unlike UHF connectors. N connectors are precision devices, and the center pin must be aligned with a depth of plus or minus 20 thousandths of an inch from the perfect setting. If the N connector pin is 20 thousandths of an inch too far recessed into the connector, you have a very unreliable connection. If it's 20 thousandths of an inch too far extending from the connector, you can always tell when this happens. If you run your finger across the end of an N connector, if your finger runs into that sharp point on the center conductor pin, throw that away. It's been incorrectly installed. And when you mate that connector with a pin that's 20 thousandths of an inch too far, extending too far out, when you mate it with a female connector, you will damage that connector permanently. So now you've got 2 connectors to replace, the one that was installed incorrectly and the one that you connected it to. Good news is modern end connectors have captive center pins. They were correctly placed by the manufacturer. So they're perfectly okay to use. It still requires skill to install them, but the center pin problem has been solved by the manufacturers. So you can use either one. If you use PL259s, a very important thing to do is don't just finger tighten them, either in your shack or outside. And everybody in this room, if you go back to your ham shacks, you're going to find PL259s that you have hand tightened. It's not good enough. It's not reliable. All you do is find your favorite tool, pliers, wrench, whatever, gently tighten the PL259 shell just enough so you can't take it apart by hand. Just enough. That way you'll know that you tightened it with a wrench, and you can identify the ones that you didn't tighten with a wrench because you can loosen them up with your hand. That's very important for PL259s. You don't have to do this with end connectors because the conducting RF components are inside. But for a PL259, the tightness of that junction is very, very important. And this is the connector I use. The website is shown there. It's widely available. A very high quality Amphenol connector. There are many other high quality connectors. I don't do research on that topic. This is what I use. It works great for me. I'm sure there are others. And waterproofing the end of coaxial cable, this is how I do it. If you have any coaxial cable outdoors and you can see any of the metallic part components of that cable, the shield or the center conductor, if you can see that, it's a recipe for disaster. If you have connectors outdoors, if you can see the connectors outdoors, that's a recipe for disaster. You want to cover them in rubber tape, and I'll show you the materials that I use. It's not expensive. It eliminates the water intrusion problem. This is what the attachment to your to the driven element of your antenna should look like. You shouldn't see any evidence of the coax cable. You shouldn't be able to see it at all. And the other important point, and I'm not going to read the others, is that the solder lugs should not be in direct contact with the aluminum tubing. They should be tightened onto the stainless steel screws that go through the tubing, and then the stainless steel screws should be tightened to the aluminum. So you do not have a solder lug to aluminum tubing direct contact. That can corrode. But if the solder lug is connected to the steel screw and the steel screw is connected to the aluminum, that's a reliable joint that will last for many, many years. And this is what that looks like when it's done. I cover the whole thing with liquid electrical tape as well. This is the material I use for waterproofing, available in thousands of locations all over the United States. I like to use this linerless rubber splicing tape. Some of the rubber splicing tape has a thin piece of plastic that separates the turns. So as you unwind the tape, you have this piece of plastic, thin plastic that, and if you're up on a tower, it's hard enough to deal with the tape without having to deal with this piece of plastic that comes out. So this is linerless, so you don't have to deal with it. It's really easy to deal with on a tower. Scotch 33 or any other electrical tape will not waterproof connections outdoors. Will not. And I'm sure there are many people here who have used electrical tape to waterproof connectors or fastening coax cable to antennas and tried to use electrical tape to prevent water entry. It does not work. Okay, Frank, how could I prove that to myself? It's easy. Get yourself your favorite piece of RG8 with two PL259s on each end. Waterproof it the best way you know how to do it with electrical tape. Then get yourself a 1-gallon bucket of water and drop that waterproof connection in the water for 10 minutes. When you take it apart, you're going to find water under that tape. Well, isn't that an unreasonable test? Absolutely not. If you look at your coax cables coming down your tower in a rainstorm, it looks like Niagara Falls coming down those coax cables. So that water coming down those cables is under pressure, and it will get under that electrical tape if that's what you've used, just like it will get under it if you put that connection in a bucket of water. The rubber splicing tape is self-vulcanizing. it turns itself into a single waterproof protection over the coax cable. You install it sticky side out. It's the 21st century. None of us read instructions anymore. But if you read the instructions with the tape, it clearly says sticky side out. And you also want to stretch that tape to about 50% of the original width. You didn't read the instructions, you didn't know that. But that's what you do. And you can tell when it's been stretched about right because it changes its color from black to a light gray. And you wrap it on. You overlap it about 50% for each turn. Yeah, I know, I don't like to waste tape, so I only do it 10% overlap. Well, then the tape doesn't work. So you overlap at 50%, and it works great. It will vulcanize into a single piece. Now, we need to protect this self-vulcanizing tape because it is somewhat sensitive to UV. So you can use any tape you want to cover it just to keep the UV out of it. I use Scotch 33, readily available, but you can use whatever you like, as long as it doesn't fall apart from UV. Doesn't make any sense to use UV-sensitive rubber tape covered by UV-sensitive electrical tape. Scotch 33 will last for decades. Okay, that's it. That's the end of my presentation. I'm not going to take any questions. I'm readily accessible. I'm going to go out that door, and if anybody really wants to ask me a question, they can meet me out behind this door, or I'll be at the Hope Hotel all night, and I'll be at the Hamvention all day tomorrow. And you know how to reach me by email, and I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone might have. And I hope everybody got a takeaway.
Yeah, I'm sure they did get a takeaway. Thank you so much, Frank. And for our final talk here this afternoon, we'd like to invite Randy, K7AGE, to the stage. And Randy, you have your slides with you, so Randy, you can take it from here, Randy. It's all yours. There's one over here, right down at the bottom.
And let's see here, where is it? I got the wrong stick. Can't find it. It's all right. We'll use what we got.
You want to go back to?
Yeah. There's only one slide difference.
There you go. I'm going to take this. It's got it loaded now. I think you can run without it. Let's make sure. Here we go.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Randy, K7AGE. Right up on it. Let me move it over here. And get right up. Can you hear me? It bends up. There we go. How's that? That's better? Okay, so I'm going to talk about my tower project and antenna. If you've seen any of my YouTube videos, I had about a 10 video series about putting all of this together. So this all started about when back in October of 2015 when we left California and moved up to Oregon. So who am I? Well, my dad was a ham, W2ELX, so I must have the ham radio gene. I got my novice in 68, I let it lapse. I got relicensed back in 71 and rode the FM craze. Upgraded to advanced, went to RIT, worked for Grass Valley Group, a television equipment manufacturer, and stepped up to externs in 91 when I didn't have to worry about 20 words a minute. And I started posting videos on YouTube back in 2006. So that's my dad's station there, and that picture I must have had my novice, because there's my, I don't know, what is that, a DX40, DX20 that's there. And the picture over on the right, that's me at probably one of the VHF field days back in Rochester. And that big black thing to the left of the fellow's head there is my dad's 100-watt AM transmitter for 2 meters that he built. So in Grass Valley, California, I had a TH6 DXX up on about a 40-foot tower that was on top of a 15-foot boulder, and there was holes drilled into it and great big threaded rods cemented in there. And off the back of the ham shack had another about a 40-foot tower with an Oscar 13 array, and I had a TS2000 FT990 and my EL82 amp. So we moved to Gold Beach. We bought the land about 17 years ago, and we designed a house, and we wanted it all on one level, and we're getting older. And it does have a large walk-in basement across one end. Large area for the shack, 16 by 24. I even have a full bathroom right off the shack, so this could either be a third bedroom in the house, but you know, it's a useful contest accessory. You don't have to wander off very far. The shack is apart from the main part of the house, and my wife says I have the best view. So this is what I see out of my window looking up to the north. So Gold Beach is right down there behind that group of trees that are down on the coast. I'm 1 mile in from the ocean, up 1,100 feet. And on a clear day, I can see a lighthouse blink 35 miles up to the north. So real good 2-meter VHF propagation to the north. So this is the layout of the house. You can see the shack is behind the garage. So we have the foyer kind of separating the garage shack from the rest of the house. So the idea is that I could go in there and close the door and make noise and not have any problems. And then we got 2 cats. One cat doesn't like closed doors. He'll stand out there and howl at me. So my wife still gets QRM from that end of the house. So in the process of designing the house, I found one of these free 3D rendering programs for things, and it has a whole symbol library. So I kind of picked the symbols that I thought would represent what I would have in my man cave here room. So this is how it turned out. The TV and the sofas there over on the left, and in the far end is where the radio desk is and the shelves that I built and all that. So, and over just to the right of the right picture, I have a workbench that I can work on projects. So I sat through Frank's antenna Q&A session yesterday, and he says, one of the first things you really got to figure out is what your goals are for your system. Don't start buying stuff unless you really know what you're trying to do. So my number one thing was new antenna system, but no climbing. I don't climb. I don't have any friends in our area. It's a pretty rural area there on the lower coast of Oregon, only 22,000 people in the county. So I don't know anybody there that can climb. If I hire somebody, they probably got to come out of Portland or something. So I want a no climb system. You know, I want everything 80 meters through 6. I wanted to get on the work bands for the first time because my Grass Valley station did not support that. We have high winds in the area there. It can be up to 100 miles an hour. A couple years ago, we had a bomb cyclone off in the Pacific, and it pushed my camp trailer 2 feet one night. And I went out there and I hitched it up to the truck to keep it on the hill. Now I have tie downs to tie down the camp trailer. So I wanted an 8 HF beam that would cover 20 through 6. I was going to hang a couple dipoles or inverted V's, depending how it works out. On the very top, I originally put up a 146-440 vertical. Then we kind of started doing a little bit of 6 FM in the area, so I changed it out and went with a Comet GP15, I believe it is, which adds 6 meters to it. And eventually I want to take one of my old KLM 22Cs from my satellite days and take out the circular polarization and make it an H or a V polarized beam. I'm also in the process of rebuilding the dipoles, which haven't got back up yet. So the tower, I didn't want anything monster. It had to meet basically 120 mile an hour wind, no guy wires, and my original thought was about 20 square feet of antenna up at the top. I wanted no climbing, so I went with a tilt-over tower with a motor drive. It is not a crank-up tower, and of course, low maintenance is always a good thing. So I ended up deciding on is a Heights tower out of Florida. So it's a 40-foot tower on top of a 5-foot base. So the top 40 feet tilts over. So then you start going through the options, the fold-over kit, the motor kit, the grounding kit, the top plate for the rotor, the bearing, and the rotor plate. And I had them anodize it, thinking that it would help protect it near the coast. Apparently they don't do that very often, so more expense and more time. So this is their website, and you can see the middle picture there. There's one that's tilted over. That's what it looks like. They engineer your tower based on all these sections they have in different widths, heights, loads. So they kind of look at your height, your load, and your wind requirement, and they say these are how we're going to stack up the sections for your tower. This is another photo I found of one. It shows the mechanism. So two of the legs make up the hinge, and then there's a threaded rod with a great big motor and goes down. I had an email from a fellow. He had a 100-foot tower, and he says it can still lift 350 pounds at the top of the tower. The most expensive ham radio thing I ever bought. Guess how much? 15, 20. Wasn't that much. It was only 10K for the tower. Then we add to it. So most expensive purchase ever. So I decided to spend the money on the antenna. I don't have that much in radios, in amps, sitting on the desk. But if you can't hear them, you're not going to work them. So ended up ordering this thing in August of 2016. It shipped around May, about 10 months. They took a couple of pictures of it because I was wondering, what is this thing going to look like when I get it? I said, do I really need that rebar cage? So I showed the dimensions and the design of that to my contractor, and we saw the size of the rebar. He says, no, I can't be bending that up. So that's 4 feet in diameter, 10 feet long. And it's rated for a little over 21 square feet at 120 miles an hour freestanding. I hope I never have to test that. So I can't get a tractor trailer up to my property, so I had them drop ship it at the local lumber yard, because they're supplying all the materials for the house. And he still wanted to charge me like $100 to bring the thing up. So they brought it up with the boom truck, set it off to the side, and and I got to pull it all apart to see what I bought. So the bottom couple of sections are tapered, so they get smaller, and the top sections are in parallel. And you can see the size of the aluminum work here for the plate where the motor is going to mount, and the hinge points. And on the bottom, I think 2 sections, they actually welded another aluminum rod up through the zigzags on the side there. I had to pick an antenna. So I did not want a long boom. It's my main thing here. I got to now have a tower that tilts over. I don't have to climb it. I'm not renting man lifts or anything. But if you have a long boom, if you have a 20-foot boom, when you tilt the tower, that means the top is at least 10 feet off the ground. And what are we doing then? We're getting on a step ladder. Or somebody else says, oh, I just parked my truck there and stand in the back of the truck. I even thought about, if I had a real long boom, I could dig a trench. So when the tower came down, those elements could drop down into the trench. So I did not want a long boom. I don't want to be working on a step ladder. I wasn't excited about a step bar. solution with the wind loads and things. I just worried about the reliability of, you know, keeping the antenna together. So what I decided on is the JK antennas. It is a Navasa 5. Does anybody know if JK is here? I don't see him in the directory. So this is a lot of aluminum for a 2-element beam. 2 elements on 20, 17, 15, 12, 24, and 6. So a lot of elements there. It's a 12-foot boom. It's short. This is not going to be a big DX station, a big contest station. One of my goals, I want to get on the bands and have fun. 12-foot boom, 6 feet of boom length from the tower to the ground. Now I can stand there and work on things. No step ladders. Antenna weighs about 59 pounds. The wind area is about 13.5. And again, it's not a huge DX or contest antenna, but it gets me on and it does work. The JK antenna, you know, some assembly required. It's nice they package all of the hardware you need for each step in a separate bag. So you don't have to sort through all the screws for the entire project there from the beginning. You get all this aluminum tubing. I rearranged it so I had band buckets here. So there's a bucket of 10 meter, 12 meter, 20, 15, and 10. So less mistakes when you go to put it together. You got everything kind of separated out. And I had put tape on there and labeled things, so helps keep it straight. This is how it will look when it's all assembled. There's basically reflectors for 4 of the bands, and I think on 10 meters it has a director off the right end there. There's a transmission line, he calls it, that takes and connects all the driven elements together. I have a nice large walk-in basement so I could assemble all the elements down there, and assembled the boom with all the center of the elements, and the longest element at that point is about 6 feet, so I can still get the thing through a door. And the construction is very similar to what Frank just showed, using those blocks on the nylock nuts. And one of the things in the manual, they do talk about pointing all those down when it goes up on the tower. So this is the transmission line that goes across all the driven elements, fed from a balun, and it's up off the boom there. It's not, you know, it's not as close as it looks. Of course, you have a new house being built, so the guys can do things while you're doing that. So they dug the trench, laid the conduit going out to the tower. The small conduit is for a direct TV dish. And Lance, my contractor, he was standing there, you know, measuring it, and he had his clipboard, and he says, "What size you want?" I said, "Oh, make it 2-inch." And in about 30 seconds, I said, "Make it 3-inch." 4-inch would be nice. So it comes out of the ham shack. There's a box there in the wall, makes a turn, goes down along the ham shack garage wall, goes underneath the slab where the driveway is not in yet, and where he's standing is where the tower ends up. So 3 years ago, I took a long vacation, hooked up my camp trailer, and drove cross country, spent a week in Oshkosh at the air show, and then I was going to go to Rochester, New York to see my sister. That means I'm going by DX Engineering. So set it up with Tim and Terry. So I appear at the store, and I do a Facebook Live with Tim when he used to do it there at the store, and we were on the air for, I don't know, 20 minutes. So before and after that, I was talking to him about, you know, I hadn't made my coax choice yet and all this stuff. So we started talking about LMR and the DX engineering cable. So I decided that the DXE 400 Max would be fine. And we talked about connectors. I don't want to solder, so we talked about the crimp connectors. Even though you have to solder the center pin, it's much nicer. You can just crimp the shield. So we talked about a bunch of this stuff. And then the next day, I met him for dinner and then went out to the ham shack. And he said, we had a marketing meeting for Summit Racing, you know, the parent, and I told the guys about your project and all your videos, and he says, we'd like to help you finish off the project. So basically go home and let me know what you want. So, you know, very generous. So I went home and I had to finish the design. So one of the questions I had of myself was, do I want a coax switch at the tower to reduce the number of coaxes to the shack, which is how I ran in Grass Valley, because it was like 300 feet to the tower, or else no switch and bring all the antennas to the shack, so that if I bought a new transceiver with dual receives and multiple inputs, I could do diversity maybe, or, you know, listen on a different band. So here's what I needed for no switch at the tower. So I need a coax for the HF beam, 40 meters, 80 meters, a coax for the vertical, for the FM stuff, another coax for the 2 meter sideband FM beam, hopefully someday, and always going to pull a spare, pull a rotor cable. I had lots of 8 conductor type cables, so I pulled several of those through. It's about 107 feet from the shack to the box, and another, you know, 45, 50, 55 feet up, going up the tower. If I put the antenna switch at the tower, that reduces a lot of the coax going back to the shack. I think I just kind of talked about all this. So anyway, I ended up thinking I'll just go with more coax so I can have the multiple coaxes in case I want to run multiple radios or dual receiver and that type of thing. So now I need to figure out how much. So I got a spreadsheet here, both with the switch and without the switch. So with the switch at the tower, the magic numbers ended up being about 733 feet of coax and about 24 connectors to put it together. Cable runs at the tower, 953 feet of cable, and a few less connectors. So Tim says, oh, I'll send you a whole spool and all this stuff. So, of course, those are all in the video. I show how to do all the prep work on the connectors and things. In the videos, I talk about coax loss. So with the DXE 400 Max, I built this spreadsheet. So say on 20 meters, yeah, we're going to 10 megs there. I have about 0.85 dB loss from the shack to the tower. Also have power in for 100 watts in, how much I'm coming out. You know, 10 meters up at 30 megs, losing, you know, almost 1.5 dB. 6 meters, about 2 meters. It's not great, you know, 3 dB, but basically all I'm working there is repeaters and, you know, local stuff. And 450.